E. Raven's Basilisk. Chapter 1. The last day in Centropolis. Birds and buildings reached above the clouds, towers of business and titanic apartment complexes amid flocks of flying rats and their predators. The sounds of the city below reaching up between the unintentional steel and concrete aviary that provided ample ledges to nest both falcon and pigeon alike. The ambient noise of the streets echoing through the heights as the crowds and traffic navigated along the early November streets far below. There among the trash and chatter, people were cutting between cars that honked in pointless offense, while the more patient of each waited idly for the lights to clear their passage. Their focus more drawn to the shops and boutiques that lined the small shopping square in Centropolis or their own lives, not on the man weaving between them. Some sparing a glance, eyes drawn to the guitar across the man's back, the instrument seemingly out of place. Most simply ignored him to curse back at a blaring horn, while others paid no mind to either, instead, simply pulling their soon-to-be traded for winter coats a bit closer. The air cooling just enough to convince most that breaking out their thicker wear early was the wiser choice for any November noonday shopping. Those that had spared a glance and pulled their light jackets a bit closer did so to ward off more than the chill. Their suspicions of the obviously homeless man with his instrument quite clear, not that the man seemed to mind in the least. Out of a great many things that had a place here in the square or even in this universe, Izime knew he wasn't one. That being a good thing, as the types of creatures that shared his powers wouldn't take lightly to fresh competition. Izime knew the safer option was to sit back and relax. So that's what he did, taking a more hands-off approach to the species he'd been the sole caretaker of in his last life. Here in this universe he would stand, maybe not beside them, but to the side. Adjacent to the cares and whims of Earth as someone who stopped by to spend some time. The issues here were already firmly in hand, managed by those who'd been written in as the planet's caretakers. Izime could just kick back and be another human who made the most of their time. Working, struggling, and above all helping where he could. Though he usually did that last bit off-world. Work and struggles tended to stick to Earth, where humans were a lot more comfortable in judging other humans. At least they kept it to a smaller scale here, though they had a guiding hand a lot earlier than his humans had. Wars broke out a lot less when odd some Joe Schmo with a cape would start throwing tanks or slapping jets out of the clouds. All in the name of peace. So the bigwigs casting their judgments had calmed down quite a bit. Though that same level of casual human judgment forced Izime to work the crowd even now. The few looks he'd noticed he returned with a smile, hoping they'd feel a bit more comfortable at the polite response. Izime more interested in watching the crowd as a whole. Carefully weaving through while they pressed towards him, observing the odd clash. Taking in every single movement and moment, still absorbing the people and the places around him years later. The oddly comfortable mixture of buildings creating a perfectly working system that clashed with the otherworldly sensibilities behind his teal eyes. Architecture and styles from various ages and comic artists pooling together to form a working kaleidoscope of a time period here. Turn-of-the-century cars popping their exhaust alongside electrics, smartphones, and payphones sharing the space alike. All having equal support and infrastructure somehow supported in a working economy. During some period that compared to the Earth he held data on from the late 2020s. It all amounted to a slightly offensive world in comparison to the reality he'd known. All in all, it felt like watching someone do what he did better. Though it also felt like the system here was cheating to achieve this flowing order somehow. Izime wouldn't judge too hard, he'd have like some cheat codes in his own reality. If he'd had those, he'd still be there. So no, Izime couldn't say this wasn't a place where he could say he belonged. He'd still allow himself to be offensively impressed in the perfection as he stayed, however. Even finding a home of sorts, which Izime was making his way back to. Even as his eyes roamed, Izime's direction remained true, ears following the beat that signaled the location of his adoptive kin. The square filled with the gentle rhythm of a makeshift drum as two stood motionless in the flow of the busy shopping area. Izime watched as the crowd passing around them like a bend in a river, the family who had helped him most in this world. Never halting, just curving their flow around the obstruction that had anchored his new life, Hugh's just a small trout returning to the comfort of those still waters. Weaving closer towards the two, Izime walked up to the man sitting on a lifted concrete flower bed. Wesson was one of the first people Izime had met in Centropolis, or at least the first he'd gotten along with decently. The dark-skinned man was seated with one worn boot stomping a steady rhythm onto a 5-gallon bucket at his feet. Thick woolen jacket showing stains and wear from the years as a yellowed bandana held his dreads back from his brown eyes. Twirling around him was a small girl, Wesson's daughter Shya. Her twisted braid swinging with the rainbow of beads that decorated the tightly woven rose. A small tambourine in her hands, the small toy tom and cheap metal cymbals enthusiastically playing a counter rhythm. The clothes she wore obviously much newer, the thick pink fluffy jacket still shiny and stainless. Though her jeans had a few holes, the faded pink pajama pants poking through underneath provided extra warmth. Slow-ass day, Wesson, Izime complained, leaning back and watching as Wesson's daughter twirled away happily. The young girl not yet fully aware of her father's struggles with busking in the chilling November marketplace. More focused on earning smiles than cash as she performed for the few shoppers that paused long enough to give a second glance. Something Izime certainly wouldn't begrudge the young girl of. He'd already had his share of burdens. Wesson nodded in appreciation at Izime, who was returning, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee under one arm and what he assumed was hot chocolate in his other hand. Izime had taken extra care to not spill the cups, walking with his guitar over his back after taking a break from vocals. Wesson cast a worried look over Izime. The coffee stains wouldn't add or detract from the tattered dark brown hoodie Izime was wearing over his nicer but still ratty jacket. Both of the coats adding layers that hid the Caucasian man's thin frame, while the jeans and boots he wore looked just as worn as Wesson's own clothes, if not worse. Mostly because they had previously belonged to the more experienced homeless man. Say nothing, lest te pote move chans. It's a good thing to be walking round the market with your guitar though. Wesson wishing Izime not bring them bad luck in Creole. Nodding and casting a glance at the small gathering of bills sitting in the small case that usually held the toy tambourine as he worried. The toy obviously didn't go to the very expensive looking round case Izime had found, but Shya had few precious things, and the case fit her toy perfectly. Izime had offered it to the girl to keep her own instrument safe without a second thought or any explanation. The strange black polymer was just heavy enough to stay put and seemed to shield the day's take regardless of how windy it got. A take that was looking like rough split if Izime took his cut. Brown eyes holding that slightly worried look, the tense features on Wesson's face slowly easing as he turned towards Izime. His brother not taking his share of the split the last few months had made things a bit easier. Something Wesson knew Izime had been holding back on for their sake. Bit of advertising, Izime nodded, placing one of the coffees down one the planter, not needing to look to know what had Wesson's tone worried. The two he'd gotten the drinks for struggling far more than he was now the single father obviously worried with winter fast approaching. Think you can give me the backing vocals for I'm the Sinner after this? Izime asked Wesson for a bit of help with their busking, hoping to fill the case a bit more. Wesson gave a slow nod as he reached for the hot cup of coffee. Thinking that the slow deep intro Izime was asking for would do well to draw attention in the square, the bluesy song well suited to Izime's voice. He had to admit even if Izime lacked range, the white boy could still pour in that soul. It was obvious the younger man had put in practice at some point in his life. Combined with Wesson's own deeper tone and the natural acoustic reverb of the shopping square, it was a sure way to score some quick cash. First act's almost done. Shya, come get a cup of hot chocolate. Taking a slow sip of his coffee, Wesson glanced upwards towards the dropping sun before calling his daughter over. Shya turned and stopped the little rhythm she'd been tapping out. Quickly running back the short distance to her father and looking down at the old dirty planter he was sitting on, to finding nothing. Her bright green eyes instead turned towards Uncle Izime, who was already standing there and holding out a cup of the sweet marshmallow topped drink. Hey Shya, think you can give me a bump and tap on your dad's next rest? Izime bent down and asked the young girl while holding out the cup of hot chocolate. Explaining what he meant a bit better as he did so, the pause after your dad stomps. Wenkapab. Yes, I can, Shya agreed, smiling brightly as she took the paper cup. Blowing for half a second, she took a tiny sip, quickly covering her mouth with the back of her hand. The drink still a bit too warm as it had burned her lips. Is Uncle Izime gonna sing more? Scowling as her hot chocolate betrayed her, Shya walked over and sat it in time out next to her father's cup of coffee as she asked the question. The young girl looking up at her father and Uncle Izime, who were watching the crowd. Their minds full of the things that worried adults, Shya waiting for a response. Izime smirked at Wesson over his coffee, taunting him a bit at Shya's apparent excitement before taking a few deep sips. The heat already being pulled away by the November chill, bringing the steam wafting around Izime's face as he watched the shoppers pass by. Wesson simply nodding at Shya while he watched the white boy's head grow several sizes. The Haitian listening to the square filling with the noise of idle chatter instead of replying, knowing it only feed that ego. The small chiming addition of the toy tambourine and drum now absent as the three prepared to bring an end to their little drink break. Izime waiting until there was a slight lull in white noise, calculating the near-perfect moment, he reached back and slipped his guitar around. Pulling the strap with a finger, Izime felt the comfortable weight of the old electric acoustic in front of him. The worn wood looking just as rough as the stained brown jacket he had over his plaid button-up. Izime felt glad the only people he cared about were his fellow performers, not worrying about how he looked for the crowd. Adjusting his jacket a bit before grabbing the cheap split body by its neck and running his fingers over the strings, Izime could feel the wooden body begin to fill with vibrations, giving a nod in appreciation at the sound. Reaching down for one final sip, he turned and sat his coffee back on the concrete planter, giving a glance at his two co-performers. On three? Izime asked Wesson and looking at Shya as he waited for a nod. Izime watched Shya's big eyes looking between her father's worn boot and himself, feet dancing nervously, afraid she might miss her first notes. Wesson didn't bother replying, instead simply beginning the easily repeated intro to the song. His lower baritone reaching through the crowd. Izime tapping on his guitar, setting himself along with the Count. Wesson was providing as Shya finally gave him a confident nod. Pulling the chill November air in, Izime was immediately glad he had gotten that cup of hot coffee. The colder air threatening to take his attempt at sounding raspy and almost snapping the notes as his voice nearly cracked. Izime shook head and doubled down as the air left his lungs, the square filled with the sound of his voice. The deep thump of a worn boot on a bucket was shortly followed by a small tap and crash of cheap metal. Izime giving an approving nod, easing Shya's worries as she'd arrived right on cue. Shya's smile grew as she watched her uncle sing. Amazed at how quickly he'd recovered, not even batting an eye in front of a square full of people. Her tiny body quickly losing that little tense nervousness she'd always felt when they performed. Shya knew they needed to do their absolute best when her uncle Izime was in town. It didn't take much to realize her life was a bit different than the others at school, something that had upset her after a while. At Shya's young age, she had easily drawn the correlations between a good performance and having a better night. A few good shows meant a new jacket or a treat, a few great shows could add to a week of clean beds. Those weeks sounding much more like the lives those bullies at school had taunted her with, those coats not getting nearly as many jeers. Something that had angered the young girl, convincing her it was worth causing a bit of trouble with those kids in school. Trouble that had eventually had her father coming into school and leaving her with a whole lot to explain to both him and the principal. After a few long talks with her father and Uncle Izime, Shya had agreed that working to better their lives was more productive than hating their situation uselessly. Shya knew it was up to her to and her father to make the most of the rare chances they had, not wanting to waste it. The only time they had a chance to really amp up their performances was when Uncle Izime was here to help her dad out properly. Uncle Izime's smile was a sure sign that this show would go off well and they'd celebrate tonight once again. Shya still had to admit that it was rather hard work, as despite their efforts the small crowd kept moving on regardless of Izime's abilities. Though now more than a few paused to tap their feet as the three buskers filled the square with a touch of live music. Some among the toe tappers already moving to toss bills into the small tambourine case. Others stopping to record with their cell phones. Wesson giving Izime an encouraging nod, both knowing the inclusion of social media usually encouraged generosity. The phones working their magic as some of those not even stopping to listen simply wandered through the frame to be seen tossing in their own change. The three trailing into other more exciting genres than the attention-grabbing blues song as it ended. All the while each scanned the crowd, finding those who could be worked with. Shya danced happily with some passing children, Izime carefully lowering his volume and changing to a lullaby as a family with a stroller full of tiny sleepers passed by. Wesson doing a bit of rapping as the acoustic songs were burned out on the crowd. Each carefully finding the moments where they could give a more personal touch, possibly squeezing out those extra few desperately needed pennies. The small gathering of bills and coins growing slowly but steadily until the sun had finally dropped far enough that the square's lighting kicked on. Wesson's foot eventually slowing as it tired, his throat a little sore from providing vocals. The man watching as Izime slid the guitar off his shoulder and sat it down beside him, hand rubbing at fingers tired from reaching for frets. Shya's tambourine tapping coming to an end as she looked up dejectedly. The lamps flickering to life around her, the first signs of an approaching bedtime. The square's lighting system activating was something Wesson and Izime had agreed was the best sign to close up shop for the day. Shya having school during the weekdays and neither of them wanting to try and work the rowdier weekend crowds that passed through the square. Younger adults more prone to antagonizing them than stopping to enjoy the music. Then there were the drunks that enjoyed fighting after leaving the high-end bars. None of it was worth the trouble they might rouse or running the risk of getting kicked from the square, so the three buskers quickly packed up their things from the hard day's work. Another day travail di, get your cut fan me? Wesson whined about the day's labor in his native tongue before motioning towards the case in Izime's hands now that they were alone. The three having already left the square through a less traveled back alley, a path more comfortable socially for the three less attractive aspects of society. The crowds were easy today, besides I still got some stashed. I do want you and this little queen to get out of the shelters for a bit, so you take this. Izime gave Shya an exaggerated flourishing bow before turning to shove the case into Wesson's arms. Find a motel. I hear about you two couching it in a trap house. I'll break my guitar over your fucking head. Wesson was about to let it slide until he felt the unexpected heft of the case, yanking Izime back before quickly undoing the clasp to at least peek inside. There among the loose change and pocket money lay a brick of much newer crisper bills still in their bank bands. Wesson swallowing back more than a few questions as he considered what little he knew of his brother. Izime had been a worse state than Wesson had originally. Wesson had found him with little beyond the rags he had managed to turn into clothes. Now just a handful of years later Wesson found himself once again thanking his stars for the turn in karma, but that quick turn only worried him all the more. Malpwoped Wesson cursed under his breath, knowing Izime could easily understand him. Still not handing the money back, Wesson instead clasped the case closed and leaned closer to Izime. The worried father trying to whisper through his tense nerves so Shya couldn't hear, "Ye best not do something stupid, Izime. That's a stack, an actual stack." "It's clean and so am I." Izime just shook his head thinking of things Wesson was better off not knowing. The words were true enough, though it had taken some work to turn that clean money into earth cash. Izime shoving the case closer to Wesson as he made himself clear, "By the way, I wasn't asking." Wesson gritted his teeth, ignoring Izime's aggressive tone on the last part, taking the case that was now stuffed full of loose bills and an actual strap band of much larger bills. It was clear enough that Izime wasn't being completely honest, not wanting to reveal the truth of where the money had come from. Wesson could also tell that it was more complicated than some petty crime, and while it might not have been spotless, the cash wasn't dirty. Izime was his brother, and he trusted him to not put Shya in danger. If his brother said the money was clean, then it was. Where it came from didn't matter nearly as much as making sure Shya and himself were taken care of. His daughter deserved a clean bed and a better life than he could currently provide, and Wesson wasn't so prideful that he'd refuse the help. As much as he appreciated it though, one had to wonder if Izime was doing something questionable or maybe even shameful to help them out so much. Wesson could tell Izime still had his own world full of secrets they'd never shared. Family always knew best after all. Is you leaving again, huh? Wesson gave Izime a bit of an accusing look as he asked the question. The man had stuck around for nearly 3 whole months this time, but Wesson hadn't forgotten that face, the spaced out look of elsewhere. Worry forcing the man back into his native Creole once more. Retune and Biento, come back quick, for Shya Tanpri? Need to take a trip, same as ever, but I will. So, you two make the most of that, Izime explained, tossing a lazy punch at Wesson's shoulder while they both watched Shya play. I had a run of luck and realized I don't need it, not like the rest of my family. It's clean and safe, your family, so I want to hear that you're clean and safe too. Same mon frere, right back at you. Wesson managed to smile through his worry, grinning the irony of his brother's lighter skin in his own hand. The shorter dreaded man pulling his lighter skinned brother in for a shoulder bump before releasing the man. Wesson carefully tucked the case under his arm before turning towards a pile of refuse in the alley as he began to remove the camouflage. Tossing a few bags and boxes to reveal a shopping cart that had been disguised as trash. Packed full of various bags and other luggage, bits of clothing and blankets poking through the mesh. Keeping their clothes and stockpile of food safe from the weather and prying eyes. Wesson busily digging around, finding a place to bury the case before grabbing an extra jacket for Shya. Wesson turned the cart to wheel it down the alley, trying to think of a question to ask his daughter, simply something to distract her. Motel 5 or best sleep in? Wesson's words dying out as he watched his once much younger daughter doing her best to act just as big as both Izime and him tried to convince her she was. The girl's father not sure if he actually wanted his daughter to be quite so mature during moments like this. It wasn't appropriate to throw a fit, but it was certainly understandable. The girl was dearly attached to Izime. Wesson wishing for a moment Shya would ask the question they'd talked her out of years back. Now Shya, you be good, okay? Izime turned towards his excitable niece, smiling brightly and confidently even as he knew he was hurting her so. Happy at least he'd take care of the 2 most important people in his new life. Even if the means were complicated, it wasn't illegal and it let Izime take care of those who needed it. Going on another trip? Shya stopped tapping at her tambourine, letting it fall to her side, eyes dropping as her tiny fist wiped at eyes that most certainly weren't getting wet. Taking a shaky breath, Shya found a canter kicker, releasing her frustration, not quite comfortable with looking at the uncle she was trying not to blame. Izime was her only uncle and only other family member in this world, and he was leaving her again. She didn't want to part with an angry look and silence. It still hurt though, her tiny world fell to pieces each time she watched the little family she had shatter. Shya had taken those first years roughly, age and repetition helping her learn that getting upset when Izime left wouldn't solve anything. Now that Shya was bigger, she understood Izime wasn't homeless like she was. She couldn't afford a home, Izime moved around too much to have one. It felt hurtful, but a part of her young heart still whispered that Uncle Izime didn't care about having a home with them, not like she did with him. Though another part yelled back that it was because her uncle was much more worried that she was being taken care of. Shya was probably spoiled like her dad said. It was easy to see Izime was doing far too much for them outside of the little work he asked for in return. If Uncle Izime stopped by, they stayed in hotels, and he'd take her swimming. She could eat at McDonald's with just a bit of puppy dog eyes. Something she knew she'd occasionally abused, possibly leading to Izime needing to leave even sooner. Shya upset with herself as she childishly wanted that feeling of being spoiled even longer. All while wanting to recognize the love she held for her uncle in letting go without a tantrum. Sniffling back the moments where she'd made the most of what little life had gifted her. The tiny girl finally looking up at the man who patiently waited through her sniffles. The strange funny man who she at first begrudgingly shared her suppers with as dad had shown him the local kitchens, now taking up a position as the second supporting pillar in her life. Still just as willing and patient with her, as she'd imagined she was with him back then. I'll probably be back around January, Izime offered, nodding at Shya who hadn't managed another steady word. Bending his knees to give the girl a warm look, holding his arms open for a hug which the sniffling Shya quickly gave. Izime tentatively giving her and Wesson a rough time frame on his return to Centropolis at the same time, never sure of just how long he planned to spend traveling. Sometimes it was a bit rough looking for places in the superhero-influenced world to ply his particular trade, sometimes staying was even rougher. Go on south, best to stay till spring. Wesson assumed Izime was chasing the warmer climates to do physical labor, only bothering to ask for one minor thing for his daughter. Be a treat for Shya to see you on the holidays, but the Kizim gratis aren't exactly welcoming, still the soup line would be warmer with you beside us, yes? Izime paused for a moment as he considered all the places he could go, had already gone in this rather odd universe. Almost instinctually refusing Wesson's offer before he'd really replied at all. North, got some business around Voltum City. Christmas is. I'll try and swing by but no promises. Izime shook his head, stopping as he took a slow breath to offer that soft commitment for the holidays. Considering for the briefest moment how much nicer it would be to go south, let alone to just stay. South didn't hold much promise aside from involving himself in the magical markets, which meant running into Constantinople. West was Middle City where Fazpaz and Thorn always seemed to be going back and forth at super speeds in a time-traveling rivalry. Centropolis, where he resided now in the middle of the USA, was the legendary Thessian psychic's home city, and Izime would never cause trouble where Wesson lived. Then there was Radiation Man, who was flying around the globe doing his Zexian best as the world's defender. James would always return to that little farm in Kansas though. Izime, well, he'd always stay on the move. I'm headed this way, you two be safe here in Centropolis, okay? Izime called out to the two who were walking away. Wesson beginning to turn the cart down the alley towards one of their little homes, probably the bridge overpass near Gateway. Ears already tuning out any calls the two might have made back. Izime turned away before cocking his head back just barely. Izime bid goodbye to Shya one last time, unsure if she could still hear him. Be good for Wesson, Shya. Izime knew it was probably a bit mean, but he'd already had a life. It had been difficult one, but educational in hindsight, and this one had its moments so far as well. So, to make the most of this rerun, Izime just wasn't going to get too deeply involved. He'd had that one life already, all those pains and joys involved with it. The already lived human had already lost one extended family, so he felt quite comfortable with his decision in keeping this one at an arm's length. That soft detachment would be how he'd trade the driving dagger that came at the end. Only suffering the smallest of paper cuts as those he knew faded away. Call it being more emotionally efficient, but that was his goal this time around. This was just a second run at the same old simulations, albeit with a few major alterations like the whole heroes and villains thing. The trade-off being there was no propagation and no Bell in this universe. Izime knew he was simply a cheap imitation, an insult what Bell had wanted Izime to be. So, this seemed like a decent plan for living this time around, actually living to some degree alongside these humans. A better plan than the one he had before that had ended in nothing but loss and him getting everyone killed. Izime would leave Earth to the heroes and take his little moments in the short slices he felt like he could handle. This way, the pleas to stay just one more day, the offer to enjoy the winter in their company wouldn't ever be too hard to resist. They'd never have to suffer a no, and he'd never have to give one. Shya could only hold back so long, and the little catching up Izime had done with the family that had saved his life years ago had drained his entire social battery. That bite of peace was all he could stand. It was better to slip away before he became too integral, too involved beyond being the funny uncle that stopped by once a blue moon. Izime continued quickly down the alley opposite of his family, his smile dropping as he recalled the barely hospitable winter haven he would be making do in. Mind focusing on his job here in this world where he could do more for them as that in-between creation. So, what if he was missing out on some things life offered? Izime wouldn't let something so minor bother him. Ironically, the what of who he was fit in well here, even if he wasn't ever supposed to have existed in this place. Once more he'd put that to use to ease the burdens of those who'd been left forgotten. That was reward enough. Sometimes being human was a pain, so he wasn't. Izime smiled at the thought stretching his neck as he walked, mind returning to thinking about where his plans would be taking him. The hot box of activity and possibility of profit, the high crime area between Voltum City and NYC's metropolis, prime grounds for turning a profit quickly. He wasn't technically a superhero himself. Izime was a bit of an odd jobs kind of guy. If you wanted to be more accurate, Izime had traded his superhero ideas to play the recycling and resource management game he knew best in this world where pickings were prime. There were massive galactic markets in this superhero-infused reality, and exactly how many people were reselling Earth goods on them. This was an opportunity to use the skills he'd honed on a scale he'd never imagined before. Not blenders or blankets, but the scraps from superhero and villain clashes. If you needed 1,000 feet of high-strength cable to run a rock climbing expo on a high-G world for cheap, Izime was the guy you called. If a ship full of refugees needed fluid pumps, demons wanted some drugs, or security forces high-quality traps for cheap, Izime was the guy that showed up. Hell, the scavenging possibilities left over by the Dark Knight family were a treasure trove just waiting for him to arrive. Let alone when things like the Razran fleet had invaded. There was junk scattered everywhere while teams of heroes battled around Manhattan. Simply kicking a bit of rubble over could reveal thousands in alien technology, some of Eagle Eye's arrows, or even a broken bit of the steel suit's armor. There were risks involved as well, but after years of successful hero scavenging, Izime was one of the best. Not a hard title to achieve when you were basically the only one in the business. Sure, there were some teams in deep space hauling ship scrap or looking for the odd relic for some evil overlord. That wasn't Izime's market though. Those overlords were putting out active requests. Izime had a more door-to-door approach with his long-forgotten or simply odd clientele. Hailing from a reality where markets had once collapsed under the influence of Amazon Prime, Izime knew the sheer value of speedy deliveries and focused advertising. That same reality had given him a shortcut to creating one of the best methods of accomplishing that in this world. Izime even had a quick list of some of the best possible clients and loot after verifying the absurd universe he was in. A perk Izime had acquired after being raised by the largest nerds on the far side of reality, knowledge he'd maybe ever so slightly abused. Pranking that Nazi schmuck stuck guarding Soul Diamond just for kicks. Saved refugees from the barren surface of Kivon while it burned, right under Vino's nose. Even held a sample of the father hexagon at one point. He'd found it shortly after the League battled Voidside. Izime risked a glance back down the alley, checking to see if he was clear just out of habit. Turning back, he glanced up towards the top of a familiar skyscraper. Lining up his ring, middle and pointer fingers over his thumb and quickly snapping them in rapid succession, leaving only a few lingering sparks that dissipated before they reached the street below. Izime magically arriving at his destination before the sparks of seared warped space could dissipate through a spell of his own creation. A method he developed after swiping a gate ring, one he'd found after scavenging a sorcerer battle. After running a few tests with its runes to verify that his idea was possible, he found a no-name shop in Tibet. One very well-paid tattoo artist had then inked the key runes of the gate ring unknowingly into Izime's fingers. Superhuman intellect already able to cheat its way around the simple requirement of recalling locations. The metal shavings from that ring and those studded symbols had been inked deep into Izime's fingertips. With a snap it activated the personal slip spell that Izime had altered from the ring's original design. Izime couldn't make an actual gate like a true sorcerer, though considering the benefits that was minor. Now there was no need for a gate, waving, or even physically moving. The entire spell simplified to nothing more than a thought and thinking being something Izime was designed to do. In his hands, quite literally, the spell had been improved all around. Activation speed faster, none of that hand-waving nonsense required, and even touch activated. There was also the fact that unless his enemy was already aware that he was using magic, they couldn't counter it unless they physically removed his hand. Unlike whoever had dropped the ring originally, this wasn't slipping off. Fast travel like this just one of the keys Izime used to keep his business booming. Even if some safety features were missing. All of them in fact. Izime stuffed that dangerously runic hand into his pocket. Ignoring the much colder winds at the top of the building, he pursed his lips to call out to his partner and child in this world. A shrill humming whistle reaching out with an almost electronic warble under the note as if someone had tinged the notes in binary. Keeping his hands in his hoodie pockets, Izime waited patiently for the familiar black-winged bird to appear, eyes catching a familiar black streak that was coursing through the sky. Cradle the raven heard its bond's call to leave from the radio tower it most certainly hadn't been snacking on. Using the reality-bending technology that had aided its birth to break the laws of physics. Moving at above max speeds without a ripple in the passing air, the black wings were flapping only for effect. Leaving a trail of feathers that turned into dust mimicking the tail of a shock cone that didn't exist. Cradle not waiting for those extra parts to rejoin, instead flapping eagerly towards its bond. This time relying on natural flight, its wings giving a mechanical rustle. The trailing feathers twisting and circling in some field of unseen energy before realigning to settle back into the raven's spread wings. Izime pulled one arm free from his grimy hoodie, holding it out with his fist clenched in expectation. Watching as the black streak halted its course, breaking in the air with an impossible stopping speed for any natural creature. The stress from unseen forces pulling some of the metallic feathers free from the energy that kept them safely locked in place at other times. The creature looked like a mixture on nanits and a certain series of movies by some bay chap an eon back in Izime's origin reality. Hey Cradle, Izime reached with his hand, rubbing a knuckle at the bird's breast while it hovered flapping comically slow for its perfect suspension midair. Izime admiring the incredible creature while asking what Cradle had been busy with. What did you get today? Cradle tilted its head, playing out a video instead of responding. One of its eyes turning as the yellow lenses were rotating underneath as a projector was exposed. A short fuzzy clip of the bird picking at tech scrap played. A black metal beak picking at the exposed RAM in a trashed PC, tiny grey clawed talons pulling at coils of wire in a junkyard before a beak quickly gobbled them down. Cradle tucking the damage done to the radio tower deep in its core drive as it replayed the things it knew wouldn't get it in trouble. Good job, Cradle. Izime proudly brushed at the raven's breast, finally holding his arm out for Cradle to land on. Feeling a bit more whole now as the familiar but still lighter than expected weight returned. Relaxing fully into the mental connection with his bond, sharing in its pride and joy. Izime had at first regretted using that tiny sliver of the father hexagon on the bird's egg he had found. Now incredibly happy to share his mind with a creature so similar to himself. The speckled off-white and grey had been infected with the higher reality technology, the shell crickling and crackling as it scabbed over with that black sheen. Regretfully thinking he had wasted the sliver on a dead egg, wondering if the idea of saving it with the alien technology had been a completely imbecilic idea. The thing had restored a human by all accounts, and even as childish as it was, Izime had wanted the egg to hatch. Even after his entire first life, Izime couldn't help his instincts. He still wanted to simulate some form of life. To create a being unique, even if it was just some tiny little living thing. That thing had laid there dead by all methods Izime could use to tell from his human body. Abandoning his watch over the wasted egg, Izime was shocked to find it had hatched only a few hours later. A few hours into Izime taking a nap, that was, waking only because of the ruckus caused as a few shells tipped over. Izime pulling at heaps of technological refuse that was rattling about, revealing a happily feasting and astoundingly fast-growing mechanical chick. Already molting the weird fluffy white down wires, it called feathers in favor of the now familiar black sheen. Time to get ready for another Voltum City run, Izime asked, waiting until Cradle had flapped its feathers a few times to settle before giving a scissor-sharp clack of its beak. Turning its head sharply to regard Izime as it thought of all the rewards Voltum offered. Money, money! Cradle flapped excitedly, turning its head skyward, calling out. Already tasting the finer pickings, the 5-course meal of technologically enhanced heroes and villains in Voltum offered. Gateway Bridge first, then Voltum. Izime nodded, feeling the feedback from Cradle's own excitement, carefully reining his own in. Mentally recalling every detail of the hideout he had established in Centropolis before snapping away. Arriving inside the hollow under the girder access location beneath the once famous suspension bridge. The space wasn't large at all, and he had to duck under the reach of the massive steel beams, but it made a decent cubby to stash his junk in while he was in Centropolis. The stop wasn't going to take long. Izime was just quickly popping in to grab a couple of duffel bags that Cradle was already casting a blue light over through the dark. Izime grabbing the black weatherproof bags from the rough-poured concrete floor and tossing one over his shoulder before having to struggle a bit. Between the guitar case already on his back and the added duffel, there wasn't enough room for a third. Izime adjusting the load a bit as he was forced to carry the second bag in his offhand while Cradle sidestepped its way further up his shoulder. Based off of Blaine's programs and our own predictions, this should be a prime time to drop in. I'm ready, you? Izime gave a look at Cradle. The two of them checking the data as graphs, charts, and maps kept popping up and minimizing in rapid succession. All currently projected the potential hottest spots for villain activity in Voltum to their shared mind's vision. Cradle rocked its head in agreement, watching as its bond raised his magically charged hand to displace them across reality. The soft echo of money money at the last remaining sign that anyone had ever visited the unreachable gap between the tension house and the concrete below. Izime, Cradle and their gear transferring just over 1,000 miles from the sprawling spread of Centropolis at center of the US to the eastern coast in less than a second. The Raven's Basilisk. Chapter 2. Soap, subs, and sorrows. The smell of city water and its slightly acrid treated chemicals filled the bathroom, along with steam as the stupid lyrics of the song which echoed around the cheap tile. A melodic voice reaching down into the deeper range of her vocals. Slightly off-key as they stooped for an octave not suited for them. Though it was certainly suited for the shower, Psyis belting out along with the pop idol Jamie Torch. Repeating the painfully repetitious chorus of yes and uns. Incredibly glad that she, unlike any of her neighbors, could soundproof her apartment with her telekinetic shielding. Giving a little wiggle as the water ran down her skin, washing both the soap and embarrassment away, blue pattern shrinking to reveal purple. The alien growing more confident in her off-key rendition of the latest pop hit. Psyis accidentally singing a bit too enthusiastically and breathing in some of the suds along her sides. A soft drawn-out cry of no chi filling the bathroom instead as the odd taste of what was supposed to smell like strawberry kiwi body wash swamped into her gills. Psyis quickly reaching outside the curtain to grab a clean cloth while she coughed deep in her chest a few times. Watching as a few little puffs of suds floated out from just under the sides of her breasts. Blowing bubbles like this wasn't nearly as funny as it had been when she was 7. Splashing around in the tub at the sense and giving Mama sent a conniption. Psyis busily wiping at the thin slits that marked the breathing vents on the sides of her chest, trying to remove the bubbles that were wafting the harsh smell back up through her nose. Finally breaking down, she reached for the spray nozzle, a deep frown forming from purple lips. The now adult woman not liking this part of accidentally messing up her bath time any more than she had as a child. The feeling of water spraying through the membranes giving her no small amount of not quite ticklish discomfort. Psyis glad that the taste and smell would be vanish after they dried, the separate breathing organs not exactly designed for submerged water in the first place. Her enthusiasm for relaxing in the shower now immediately taken away, she quickly finished scrubbing up. Though much more carefully this time, wanting to avoid any further mishaps as soap in the eyes sucked regardless of species. The Thessian hurried, washing and conditioning the long white mohawk she'd grown out. Running her fingers along the smooth sides of her head, feeling for any spots that'd need to be buzzed again. Psyis wanting to ensure that at least her hair was remaining wild and independent. Satisfied in her appearance and finally clean, Psyis quickly turned off the water and snatched the towel from the rack on the wall. Throwing the shower curtain back with a vengeance as the evil cold of a cheap apartment threatened to steal all the warmth she'd trapped inside with her. Dabbing at herself with the soft fluffiness as goosebumps ran along her blue stripes. Psyis removed the now ice-like droplets with the warm towel. Drying before carefully holding it over the side of the tub and stepping onto the bit that had curled on the floor. Getting a bathroom rug so she didn't have to stand on the freezing tiles had come second to owning these particularly fluffy towels. Scooting her feet about before drying them as well, Psyis turned and threw the towel over the shower rod before sprinting to her room to change. Grabbing her hoodie and quickly slipping it on, not even bothering with the bra she'd laid out before snagging the bovine pattern pajama bottoms Jack had gotten her last Christmas. The words "moo mooed" distributed across each cheek of the milk cow pattern bottoms. They were at least super fluffy and warm, even if they were mortifying to wear. Her adoptive brother of sorts getting her the most comfortably uncomfortable pajama bottoms she'd ever admit to owning. Psyis still refused to pull the matching top out from her drawer, the gag gift just a bit too uncomfortable with where they'd printed a milk me. Heading to the kitchen, she recalled how Mama had also decided that was the absolute last year she was letting any of the older kids do gag gifts. Especially seeing as none of the farm-raised children present had needed an explanation on just what the pun was. They'd done the actual chore themselves. The older woman nearly dying of shame as more than one child turned to their parents, now asking the most awkward questions possible. Starting with whether or not their off-world two-toned cousin was milkable at all. The purpose of the Thessian's mammalian additions coming into question. All while Jack was rolling on the floor trying not to accidentally laser anyone. The young Zexian laughing so hard he'd almost lost control of his heat vision. James and Leona simply standing there looking every bit like the city parents who'd let their child bring the world's troubles to the farm in a completely different manner than usual. It tended to be something more explosive and less explicit that came following Radiation Lad home. Leona looking like she was leading a press conference gone wrong, mouth moving with no answers available. His father James only trying to look disapproving as he'd had to stifle a giggle of his own. Psyis tried not to think about how life had felt during those moments, the wonderfully tense perfection of a home packed to the brim with life and enjoyment. Simply leaving the memory of how Mama sent her dragging James and Leona off in her own much emptier and more lonesome Centropolis kitchen. This wasn't the Sense farmhouse obviously, and thinking back on home like a child wouldn't help her move on with life. Hell, the tea wasn't even as good when she made it here. Stepping out onto the balcony, Psyis let the cool November air wrap its fingers under the hem of her pajama pants as its other hand grabbed a fistful of steam from her cup. The Thessian glanced around the narrow alley that her balcony let out onto. It didn't offer much of a view, the area only a convenient benefit of needing to meet the code for having a fire escape. Still, since she'd moved here a few months ago, the Centropolis Angel had found one lovely thing about her cheap apartment: it came with free music. The volume might be lacking, but still it seemed like every song was an original, full of emotions, and written with some of the most vivid lyrics she'd ever heard. A small silver lining in the dark cloud of decisions that had led to her living here. A striped hand pulling at the string that was attached to the bag idly while she blew away November's chilly hands off her mug, thinking about what life had in store for her. Closing her eyes and swaying with the lyrics the wind had twisted, the Thessian took a sip of her tea, glancing out at the world she'd come to love. Not a native of Earth, she'd still managed to grow up stateside after being discovered by Radiation Man, otherwise known as James, sent appearing as a child, misplaced by the psychic disturbance that had warped every other living Thessian away. Psyis had struggled to not only understand the world she'd arrived on, having difficulty with her own powers as well. The Cent family, especially Mama Cent, had helped her acclimate to this new world as the only surviving member of her species, as if she'd been born for the task. The elderly Kansas woman already having run that particular gauntlet with her own adoptive son and the handful of off-world miscreants he'd managed to drag home since his first Zexian pup. Life from there had been full, both with its high moments like the day she'd finally been promoted from the Junior League of Planetary Saviors to its lows. One of which was the reason she was currently standing on the cheap narrow balcony rimmed in cheap black painted steel, Stephen Blaine. The name causing Psyis to feel some disconnect with the new song below. Turning back, she opened the door once more, deciding she'd make some lunch. Content to return to the balcony when the song fit her mood a bit better. No longer interested in listening to the soulful drawl echoing below, not feeling any of the same desires the singer did for their lost love. She knew, looking back, there had been signs that she'd ignored. Growing pains in the relationship that she'd allowed to turn into more, that or it was just her own inability to accept the reality of who she'd allowed into her life. Psyis sipping at the bitter infusion of leaves in her cup as she looked back on her choices as she headed towards her refrigerator. There wasn't ever going to be that depth she'd wanted in that relationship, thinking she'd been swept away by a dynamic, complex man. Wanting to soak into who Stephen was had been a shallow puddle compared to the dive she'd expected. Now dealing with the misbegotten expectations on what her love had been as it crashed into the reality of who Stephen was, entirely one-dimensional. Even her own skin still reflected her indecisive, complicated emotions on the issue, her pattern swimming like waves as it rolled between dominating colors of purple or blue. Ignoring her changing color, Psyis instead sit her mug on the counter, opening the fridge so she could see just what leftovers she'd be trying to make edible today. Finding several boxes, the quickly administered sniff test had demanded she trash the idea quite literally. Quickly grabbing the other three with similar, but slightly more worn-looking logos, she immediately walked over to the trash and pitched them. At first lazy enough to consider the leftovers, grabbing a simple fried rice and throwing it in the microwave, Psyis was left looking for another option. "I'll order something," Psyis explained to the nobody who was listening as she shook her head in disappointment, the food choices feeling like an actuate representation of her life right now. A thing she'd sit down half-finished, now just to let rot and fester instead of trying to actually replace or move on from. Convincing herself she didn't want to brave the chill outside of her apartment to get actual groceries, not postponing the inevitable. Besides, she was paying to rent the damn place with nearly all of the leftover income earned from being a heroine, so spending as much time ensured she got her money's worth. This was the more childish of the adult choices she'd allow herself at this moment, and only a minor expense in comparison to the dignity she'd sacrifice if she crawled back to Stephen so soon. Seeing as she'd left the relationship, Stephen had also stopped helping her financially, not that he'd actually been helping in the first place. It was incredibly hard to ever try living alone and learning to budget when your then boyfriend would just pay your rent for the year or buy your entire apartment building. Not that the underpaid and overworked heroine had wanted access to the Blaines' fortune in the first place. Psyis had even told Mama since she'd needed to make it on her own as a human in this world, wanted to live a life outside of the Cape. Psyis sighing slightly as she pulled the worn Samsung from her pocket, tapping at the cracked screen a few times before it responded. Scrolling through her contacts towards the familiar subshop, ignoring the slight twinge that came to mind, idly noting the absence of Stephen's name among the SS as she scrolled towards her favorite subshop. The alien taking some minor comfort that little psychological tick over her ex had never reached her heart even after all the times they'd done this. It wasn't jealousy, pain, or anything actually emotionally driven, it felt as oddly and irrationally natural as the need she was about to satisfy right now, the phone in her hand beginning to ring the familiar delivery place. Two usuals? The phone to the shop clicking with its usual prompt familiarity, the person answering not even bothering to ask as the caller ID had already tracked her rampant laziness. Psyis took it as a blessing and not a sign that she was slacking off in her own desires to be independent and self-reliant. She was relying on herself to call the subshop after all. "You know it, Mr. P," Psyis giggled a bit as she heard the familiar voice answer the phone. Quickly adding something to the order while she casually filled her friend in on her plans. "Extra mushrooms and mozzarella please, I'm starving and going out of town this later tonight." "You got it, Miss P," the slightly high-pitched voice coming back as it cracked slightly with youthful nervous flotation, the delivery boy obviously smitten with his celebrity regular. "Free of charge of course, anything for the angel of Centropolis." "Thanks Phil," Psyis brushed her hair out of her face as she dropped her head. Hanging it slightly in embarrassment at the nickname, but even more at the slight shame that suddenly dropped on her. The idea of spending the extra $5 for the extra toppings already weighing on her, now oddly heavier than the burden of saving lives in some way. The young boy who often delivered her sandwiches waiving the fee more often than not hadn't been the only reason she'd called, but it had certainly been worth rolling the dice. The kid was sweet, but puberty had firmly convinced he was her diamond in the rough now that Jamestone's tabloids had spilled the news about her and Stephen. Not that she'd intentionally advantaged that, but it was a little tidbit she'd stored away about the delivery boy. Just like Jamestown had stored away her name just so he could take a cheap shot at the webslinger in NYC she'd tried to rebound with a few years back. Tyler Tanner had been sweet enough and hadn't deserved the runaround relationship she'd offered, especially as that was all the poor guy got from anyone, ever. Psyis briefly considering calling the ex-turned friend just to see how he was doing, Tyler always being good for a laugh. As horrible as that sounded, it was just the more comfortable offer, one she'd accept in a few more years. Hopefully by then Stephen would have matured to some degree, finally settling down to at least play at being an adult like his adoptive father Stan. Psyis reminding herself that it wasn't entirely Stephen's fault he'd not taken well to the affluent upbringing as a younger teen. Anger, angst, and the expansive bank account enabling the growing adult to fully immerse himself in the new Ava-ish lifestyle with old money resources. The Thessian once again glancing at that cheap chair beside her, thinking how much more comfortable it'd be to settle back on that posh balcony in Voltham. Voltham. At the same time, she also had a firm grasp on just how uncomfortable the balcony and lifestyle had made her at the same time. The way Stephen seemed to unconsciously accept that vast disconnect between Stephen and who he really was inside, Dark Squire. If he'd really just been an ignorant rich kid, maybe she'd have never realized the two very different personas she was trying to accept into her life. Dark Squire was always going to be Dark Squire though, no matter what outfit or face he was wearing there would always be the mission. Stan had at least managed to temper his own personal issues by reining them back under the guise of justice. Stephen, though, would never turn off. The missions never stopped, whereas justice could have its day. Closing her eyes tightly as she considered just what his mission was, controlling the idea of them. Stephen using whatever misbegotten logic or excuse he could to keep her wrapped in his intentions to realize his idealized view of living the heroic lifestyle. Nothing like the calm, laid-back life that she'd grown accustomed to and admittedly slightly bored of in Kansas, even if it was so often interrupted by some world-ending calamity. Maybe I'm just selfish or looking for the wrong things? Psyis quietly considered, as even those moments had been filled with cows and corn and not exactly the human life she'd watched being played out on the tiny television while feeding chickens. Mama Scent had always warned her that watching too much TV would rot her brain, and maybe it had. Rubbing a mottled finger at her temple, Psyis blaming herself for how she just wasn't happy with any of it, Stephen, Kansas, and even her life in Centropolis with its free music and bad tea. Even now she was just settling for being alone, and settling was the best she could do. Psyis focusing back on the music as she watched the shadows along the brick wall opposite her, leaning back in her seat. She'd inevitably go back to Stephen after she'd had a few years of just being her and enjoying the more human condition. After that she'd need to pull the guise that Stephen was building for himself over this period of her life, dutifully burying it under the rug as she settled into the role he intended for her and her own career. There were bigger things to consider at the end of it all, her position in the league and the people she owed for helping her get there. If she got back with Stephen, it would at the very least pay those debits back. How many would really complain if they got hitched to some filthy rich human, just to kick back and enjoy their heroing days? If she just followed her bank account, it didn't sound too bad either. No rent to pay, no more feeling guilty because she was teasing some poor boy for a few free toppings. No longer need to worry about things as Psyis, because what were those personal issues in comparison to the bigger picture of the Miss Psyis? The woman sitting down the cup of tea and pulling her knees closer, tucking her head in between them. Loosing herself a bit as the identity of who she knew the world expected her to be clashed against what she'd dreamed of, kicking herself for not even knowing what that dream had been. Psyis sighing in the dark comfort she'd encircled herself with, wondering if out there in any of the multiverse there was a version of her who truly felt like they had a choice. A dark chuckle of Schadenfreude hitting her as someone else seemed to be experiencing the same helplessness just on a much smaller scale, as a song and not their whole life. Anyways, this one's called Wonderwall. That familiar voice called out from the square that shared the same block. The Thessian smiling, wondering if the singer felt the same way she did, because it certainly sounded like it as he whispered under his breath. You tasteless shits. The alien quietly looking up and blaming the unknown singer for being the sole reason the rain clouds had hung over her heart for the last few months, even as she smiling brightly. Only able to hear the tired exasperation they'd hidden back as they'd mocked the crowd because of her super hearing. Apparently, a bit upset that more than a few of those clapping had gathered, only waiting on him to perform that one song alone. The heroine had to admit their way with words and imagery were incredibly imaginative compared to the rather mundane songs that littered the airwaves in comparison. Trash like Turn My Fire On topping the chart simply because they'd been produced by heroes like Jamie Torch the Human Inferno. This song certainly having more to it than the 2 or so words Jamie had tried to croon for his awards. Psyis even finding that after she'd heard the song so many times over the last few months, she was quietly singing along despite the distastefully ironic lyrics. Looking down at the square as the song came to a close, she made a promise to herself that she'd go and find out who the singer was before she brought her time in Centropolis to a close. There were years yet and there wasn't a human on this planet who could hide from her. She'd just need to find the mind that was full of those wonderful songs. Psyis deciding she'd find him, blame him for these stupid sad moments, and then tell him it was okay to never sing that song again if he hated it that badly. Then she could check that off the list of things she'd wanted to do before she'd have to write Blaine in as her last name. At least one of them should have a choice of what they did in their lives. Not singing a song was far easier than denying the family that had helped you advance every step of your career. The sound of a knock at her door reminding Psyis that she'd need to sign away a lot more before she ever got to that point, quickly sprinting through the kitchen at the sound of familiar voice. Hey Miss P, I've got your subs. Phil called out, standing in the hallway as he checked his appearance in the peephole super quick. Hoping that his curly red hair was evenly puff about and not squished because of that stupid hat his stupid boss made him wear. The young boy wanting to look at least somewhat nice when the city's newest celebrity opened the door. Not that Miss Psyis hadn't been famous before, but the startlingly beautiful alien certainly hadn't been ordering subs from his dad's shop a few months ago before it'd been announced she was moving to his city. The young man had been curious as to what James Tone had been doing when the headlines ran, celebrating Centropolis getting their own major league heroine. The gimmicky headline artist usually much more focused on writing hit pieces, certainly not dishing out clever names like the Centropolis Angel. Now Phil certainly understood just what had swayed the tasteful journalist, having seen the Thessian woman in person. She certainly was as the name described, Phil stupidly not even thinking to keep his thoughts elsewhere as the door opened to reveal the woman that was running amok in his brain. Hey Phil, Psyis opened the door happily before swinging it back closed just a bit, the divider unfortunately not stopping the young man's thoughts or eyes. The Thessian immediately regretting wearing the stupid pajama bottoms, as fluffy as the material was it was also very stretch and tight-fitting. Psyis knew if she turned, she'd leave little to the imagination. already very happy that the oversized hoodie was covering anything in the front that might catch the kid's eyes, as she wasn't even wearing a bra. She was confident it hadn't been that cold outside. She knew nothing was showing for him to ogle right now, but it would only give him more of an excuse. His fantasies coming non-consensually into her mind, Psyis carefully reaching behind her to make sure the stupid words on her but were covered as well. Pretending she was reaching for her purse, while she made sure she wouldn't give the teen any further ideas about her to dream about. Nice as the boy was, she wasn't going to shame him just as long as he stuck to thinking about it. Thinking it. Still, he could go watch a movie if he wanted a tip like that, because that was the only place it was happening, no matter how coincidental her attire was. The simple men's wallet she actually used floating its way outside of her bedroom, a psychic hand quickly bringing it from where it lay forgotten. Psyis' actual hand pulling the hoodie down as far as she comfortably could without appearing nervously flirty, constantly monitoring Phil's thoughts. It's $18.99, Phil didn't realize where his eyes were as he held out the bag, simply stating the price as he watched Psyis quickly try and cover those hips. Though the view of her shapely thighs poking out from under that puff of a hoodie was just as enticing to the young man, reminding him of some of the girls he'd actually attempt to flirt with instead of just dreaming about. Sure thing, Psyis nodded while she looked for the money. As always, you can keep the change, but only as long as you're safe riding back. Okay, Phil? I'll be fine, I walked today anyway, Miss P. The delivery boy said a bit irritably as he considered how he hadn't been able to ride his bike through the packed shopping square lately. Why? Psyis asked, wanting a bit more information that the vague frustration and images of people that were crossing Phil's mind. Scenes of him taking a spill or crashing into various people playing past quickly as she considered that someone might be bullying the poor kid. Crowd's a bit too thick with those buskers taking up the square down there. Phil explained in frustration, not realizing that his complaints and the fact he was now withholding food to complain was irritating his favorite customer. Instead, more focused on detailing just how hard he tried to solve the problem, even getting his father involved. Dad's tried to have them kicked out, but they're technically not causing a disturbance yet. They don't seem so bad? Psyis glanced back towards the balcony on instinct before whipping back around, her powers alerting her to the young man's eyes. Her tone reflecting her disappointment in Phil's wandering gaze as well as their treatment of the musicians. I like the music. Sure, they sound great, but as far as looks go? With a bit of a laugh, Phil held up the bag in explanation, watching as Psyis took it. The young man, still adolescent mind, excusing his stereotyping as he acted worried about the family business. Try selling sandwiches with a handful of homeless people right down the road and you'll see how quickly everyone loses their appetite. If it's affecting your dad's business, the city should do something, right? Psyis took the bag and sit it on her kitchen counter, careful not to turn this time. Crossing her arms as she waited for an explanation, already digging through Phil's prejudice towards her source of free entertainment. Masking her own guilt in not paying for the shows she'd enjoyed while the shoppers apparently were bystanding up for them now. I mean it is. Phil nodded enthusiastically, thinking that the actual Miss Psyis might come down to solve the issue at his family's shop. Carefully tempering his imagination at what the alien meeting his folks could lead to as he watched her white brows furrow, his fire dying out into a weak excuse. It's just kind of hard to prove that to a bunch of badges. Is the shop actually doing worse because of them? Psyis raised a brow, already knowing the answer, not surprised at how quickly any of the idle fantasies in the kid's mind vanished. Recalling how easily swayed Stephen was, she knew that's the way they were at this age. As soon as she disagreed with some minor issue, they wanted to die on magically. She wasn't the fantasy woman anymore. It's $18.99, Phil held up the bag again, not wanting to have the same argument he'd had with his father. Fine, maybe the shop wasn't doing any worse because of the noise, but still it was embarrassing to have a bunch of societies reject sitting outside your door. Rolling his eyes now instead of running them over Psyis as he played pretend. No longer interested in trying to imagine the very well-hidden curves under that hoodie. If they're all the same, then at least mine has billions to spend. Psyis kept the thought to herself, imagining Stephen buying a record company and how she'd cut a deal with the singer outside. Show Phil just what happened when you started looking down on people. The psychic feeling more than a bit upset on their behalf after being similarly violated in another matter by the young man. Here, a 20. Psyis held out the bill, nearly shutting the door before she'd finished, wishing the young asshole well on his way back. Be safe on your way back. The alien once again chewing through the bitter point of her earlier thoughts as she unwrapped her lunch. The extra mushrooms and mozzarella no longer holding the same enticement they'd had before as she looked at the freshly toasted sandwiches. Trying not to think of her new usual, the usual order, the same usual cheap apartment and same usual life she'd asked to try living. Mind already drawn to the city of Volton, where she'd agreed to go later tonight after Stan had gotten her to agree to working with them. Even as she'd yet to really settle into being Centropolis heroine, she was still crawling back to Volton to be by the Blaines once more. That bite going down as bitterly as her decisions. What was the point if she was just going to have to settle at the end of it anyway? The Raven's Basilisk. Chapter 3. The first night in Volton. Bits of sparks fizzled angrily as they touched down on another concrete floor, here the porous grey darkening with sweat. The lingering glow casting a senseless series of shadows that lasted just as long as the spell had. Orange lights reaching up in long cut squares and divided bars to illuminate nothing more than that same darkening grey. Blackness returning to the room to greet its two new visitors, a voice echoing slightly as Izime asked Cradle to remove the unwanted owner. "Little light please, Cradle?" Izime's voice cut through the blackness just a moment before the blue glow provided by Cradle's eyes spread over the room Izime had selected. It had possibly been a junction room at one point, then stripped. Now the hollowed remains of cable boxes and pipe inlets were all that remained, giving rats the only access to the sealed room. It had once reached by its operators through a reinforced steel door. Now that thick steel door had been rendered inoperable due to rust and the settling of the soil over time. That or sealed intentionally, seeing as there was technically one resident, though the overly large skeleton hardly added anything to the atmosphere of the room. The handle for the massive locking gear on this side was wrenched as if someone had tried to tear it off, the main culprit being said skeleton. Thick slats like tiny bits of slate were rusting, peeling away as the season cycled through. Now wet and slick with the winter humidity that combated the warmer Voltum sewers. Izime carefully set down the guitar case in the darkness behind him. It was a soft case after all, and the abandoned room was concrete. Turning to move both Cradle's light and him, Izime tried to locate his target using Cradle's flashlight vision. His search a bit difficult with all the industrial leftovers on the walls, Izime instead looked up. "Let's see," Izime whispered as he glanced at the lights on the ceiling, eyes following the sealed pipe cable protector until he found a switch on the wall. Clicking it a few times to no effect, Izime sighed, disappointed he'd even considered the notion. Dead. No surprise there. Turning towards a shelf along the wall, Izime pulled a small box down, rummaging through while Cradle hopped off his shoulder to provide better lighting. The soft muttering of battery filling the gaps between the occasional drip as both man and crow searched the box. Finally locating one of the incredibly handy portable power bricks, Izime checked the bar on the side, finding it partially full. The tiny things were probably the most versatile and best-selling tool Izime had discovered so far. A simple battery, well, simple to use. How exactly it managed to be absolutely universal in both powering other things and recharging itself still a mystery. Izime didn't plan to look a gift horse in the mouth. These weren't his physics, nor were they his laws of energy conservation. He'd take all cheesy sci-fi he could get, already having suffered from the bullshit laws that ruled his home. Thank God for advanced alien technology. Grumbling though it was, happily Izime took the small square device and twisted the dial on the front. Frowning as nothing happened, he quickly gave it a hard tap on the shelf next to him. Two counter-rotating sets of teeth appearing and whirring to life as it finally activated. The sharp edges slightly hooked to not just shear but smag at cables and other electronics, a tiny inlet sliding open to accept nearly any connection or power. Like I said, Izime grunted as he slammed the power brick onto the protective cover just above the light switch, holding it there as it worked away. Letting the teeth eat through and pull in each cable inside, individually sorting connections through whatever tech voodoo that made the device operate. Finally seeming to have pulled in enough to lock from the tension, 4 arms shot out, clamping into the wall. Thank God for advanced alien. Izime sucked in a breath before giving the switch a final flick, shouting as the lights finally activated. Glancing over at Cradle as he finished, the excitement spreading. Technology, baby. Cradle giving its own core of excitement and flicking its blue lights off as the room was finally lit fully. Exposing a simple room with their companion of an overly large skeleton in the corner. Along the far wall, a few rows of shelves holding a couple boxes, against the closer a spring bed with no mattress or cushion. Their closeness and position having formed the oddly layered shadows from before. Izime nodded as he looked back towards the broken door, the duffel bags dropping. Joining a stash of other supplies that he'd prepared beforehand. The goods already on the floor were just odds and ends of gear that might be handy. A few smoke bombs, various electronic diversions, as well as some handy signal decoys all lay near some less well-intentioned gear. The duffels he'd brought with him now had a few quilts and blankets to make the bed more comfortable, along with some ram sticks for Cradle to munch on. He'd not wanted damp bedding or Cradle's food to start corroding away while stored in Voltum. Fresh memory cheaper to buy than letting the Raven have at the tech they might snag in Voltum, so keeping some good RAM around was just good sense. The boxes on the shelves were full of some nice surprises he had stashed after scavenging the battlefields of actual heroes. A few spare gate rings, a stash of those power bricks, a few grappling guns and ropes from Dark Knight. Then a tiny yarn ball of prototype metal webbing, and collection of actual guns from Voltum's PD and goons. Another more complex box was locked tightly as it held few tubes of very questionable nanits along with Izime's scavenging outfit. The outfit was there to keep it safe, and as added padding for those delicate tubes, the nanits were sealed in a weird clear liquid Cradle had produced after fighting off the infection they had given it. Izime didn't know where the Raven had caught them, but he kept them just so the unknown critters couldn't wander. Izime pulled the locked box down and opened it, the hiss of its vacuum seal breaking filling the room. Reaching in, he carefully unwrapped the tubes to take the items that had been in with them. It was time to start gearing up. The heavy and long yellow raincoat wasn't exactly the best get-up for sneaking around, but Izime wasn't trying to catch a round because he was the dark figure in the alley. Replacing it would be difficult. Those yellow suits from Fazpaz's insane time-traveling rival were hard as fuck to find. Truly a bit of top-tier legendary kit considering it was both frictionless and highly visible. High-vis was probably the better feature of the coat honestly. Ideally Izime would show up after the actual fight went down and before the heroes or their crews could come and clean up. More than once though the loot had been tempting enough to risk jumping in mid-showdown. That really upped the risk factor, the occasional close call where Izime had even resorted to playing the scared civilian just long enough to disappear. Those alone had convinced him that being highly visible was in his best interest. The incidence of narrowly avoided shots and not so well avoided sharp objects had decreased sharply after creating the high-vis coat. Along with that impressive coat was a pair of higher-end combat cargo pants, bulletproof vest, and civilian gas mask. The cargo pockets were a necessity, too handy for snagging the odd dark erang or alien technobauble. Their Kevlar weave was only really useful against thrown objects, not even really stopping a good thrust, beyond that the built-in padding kept his knees safe from the odd bump or badly timed snap. The vest was self-explanatory. Bad guys used guns, and the really bad guys could punch a bullet towards things intentionally. So, a bulletproof vest was just entry-level protection for the mere mortal man. The rest Izime relied on his own senses enhanced by Cradle's bond to aid him in snapping out of the situation. The gas mask was useful for when the police inevitably showed up and started tear-gassed everything into oblivion. Though like the vest far less handy against the concoctions villains could produce. Izime usually tried to keep those contained, usually far too dangerous to sell. Though the few that he did were very profitable in the right circles. Everyone needed a little pick-me-up, even if it was a psychosis-inducing gas. Taking the scavenging outfit Izime placed each item on the shelf and resealed the box. The box's lid clasping with a hiss as it began to vacuum itself closed. Izime nodded as he considered it the best protection he could offer the delicate tubes. Finally spinning the dial to reset the lock as the interior bars slid into position. Glancing at the various watches on his arm Izime located the one etched with the Dark Knight logo. The whole city of Voltum leaning into its capitalist roots and hawking the touristy thing which now had its two arms indicating 8 p.m. Well, it was a little later but there was still a bit of downtime possible, Izime planning to make the most of it. I'll give you some. Izime walked over to one of duffel bags and unzipped it, rummaging before pulling out a few silicon rectangles. Holding them up Izime took a look at the printing on the sides of the stick reading as he asked, DDR, for if you go out and scout. Watching as Cradle nodded its head excitedly, catching one of the sticks in its beak. Grasping it in its talon and tearing a few chips off greedily before flapping over to one of the shelves. Resting the stick down among a few other already picked over pieces that had all been gathered into the once empty corner of a shelf. The raven tucking the once shiny, now scratched stick into its newly made nest. I'll set an alarm for 3 hours. Izime nodded towards the door pulling out a beaten-looking flip phone, watching as Cradle began to separate into smaller nanite structures. The otherworldly technology slipping through the tiny, rusted gaps in the steel door as Cradle left to scout the skies above Voltum. Izime turning towards the power brick on the wall, taking a quick measure of that small blinking light bar on the side that indicated the energy drain. Odds were the device would either power the light for a day or for the bulb's entire lifetime. Either way Izime wasn't going to risk it burning out, his supply was limited after all. Flicking the switch, he felt his way along the shelf, carefully avoiding the box of parts he had left on the ground. Finding the bed using the dim light, Izime tossed the duffel full of blankets onto it before pulling some out at random which flicked out. Letting them fall at random in the dark before tossing himself on top with a groan. The meager bed already 1,000 times more comfortable than the usual cardboard he and Wesson made do with. Looking down at the serviceless cell phone Izime set an alarm for 3 hours and laid back waiting for sleep to take him. 11 p.m. sounding like prime time for Voltum's finest filth, and with Cradle monitoring for hot spots of action ahead of time tonight could be very profitable. Wesson and Shya wouldn't need to worry about a hotel just over the winter, he could get them an apartment if he kept this up. Hell, maybe tonight he'd even find a cool mask to complete his outfit, though not a lot went with bright yellow. Maybe he was better off with the big-eyed gas mask. Izime slipped into dreams of redesigning his outfit. Outside above Voltum's sky. Cradle glanced down at the city of Voltum through the cloud layers, watching as the light of the sun withdrew its warmth. Eyes glancing down, zooming with a capability that would have seemed impossible to any who'd believed in the limitations of earthly technology. A view made possible by its sensors sweeping with an absurd level of detail. At an altitude usually reserved for a different kind of blackbird, the Raven was performing much the same duty as the old S.I-71, only to a far greater degree. The Raven pinging and highlighting the individual antenna that was scanning with what it had decided was Dark Knight spectrum. The Blaine Enterprise funded towers checking for nearly any kind of signal, though its attempts were pitiable. The meager signals reflecting uselessly or being absorbed, the returning data obfuscated with false information. There were few in the universe that could rival Cradle. Blaine's attempts are laughingstock when compared to the truly living technology. Cradle, cocking its head, considered whether it should preen itself first or eat when it got home. The work it was doing deserved a good meal, but its pride was being stroked as each sweep from Blaine failed to detect it. deciding it would first relay all the information it had collected to its nest program. The fleshy sentient known as Izime was of course not its actual creator, but Cradle had registered Izime as its admin user happily all the same. The man's choices had brought it life and so was granted loyalty and instinctual protection. Cradle's biological instincts combining with technological controls in its tech brain to grant Izime alone usage of the advanced tech raven. First report, then preem because it was doing such a good job, finally eat, and then it would be work time for Izime. Cradle subroutines checking the microseconds that had ticked by, between the last scan and the predicted next one, and when Izime would awake. Another sweep passed over as Cradle returned to its own monitoring, its attention locking onto the same thing Dark Knight sensors had or would if they had its range. Work! 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 Cradle called excitedly, confident neither Blaine sensors nor their target could pick up its joyful cries at this range. Cradle sending a small digital marker to pin itself onto the Thessian signature before sending a direct update Izime even though he was still sleeping. The notification would wait until he woke, the data in Cradle's thoughts patiently waiting for Izime to parse through later. The Raven began adjusting their mutual projections for tonight alone in the meantime. Flying heroes meant big fights mean big money meant better RAM. Food was flying in directly below Cradle, enough for a whole week if not the month. That light lavender blur streaked below Cradle and above the smog-ridden tops of Voltum's industrial sector. Halting mid-air, the blur clearing as the wash from the above Mac flight crashing against a white cape and sterling silver suit. The outfit unadorned aside from the smallest details, the silver not being a cloth but scales that provided its wearer with ample protection. The crack of the air breaking over a slim, super-strengthened body only served to disturb the long fringed strip of white hair. Strands of it fluttering against shaved sides, catching on the ridges that lined stripped ears, a hand with similar purple and blue mottling reached up to brush it away. Red eyes glancing at the crime-riddled streets Volthumites called home, the dark city a stark contrast to her own home. Miss Psyis was Centropolis' psychic alien heroine and had only flown here to assist her fellow heroes in Voltum. Her gaze working across the city as she let her mind wander further across the crime-festering alleys below. Reaching out to see and sense, thin white brows furrowed in effort. Lighter blue lips pursing. The odd itch that had tickled at her mind having gone moments ago already. An unknown but oddly natural feeling sensation, so much so it could have simply been a trick of her own imagination. There wasn't anything there, but she swore there had been something, a passing hiccup in her mind. Perhaps just an odd fluctuation in her powers as she'd admittedly been distracted. Psyis running her eyes back over the city as she tried to catch the slipping dream of whatever had passed just a moment ago. The Thessian crossing her arms in frustration, Psyis upset that her own thoughts had been elsewhere. Concerned with things she'd sworn to already let go, she hadn't and so she had missed it. Whatever it was, if it had even been real to begin with considering how odd the sensation had been. Not a human thought but something else, like her own powers had passed through a funhouse mirror and come back all distorted. Though learning her own powers as a solitary Thessian had been a bit difficult. As such, Psyis only had the information she'd gleaned stumbling through with her own self-discovery about what her powers felt like and were capable of. The most solid conclusion she had at the moment was it was either imaginary or inhuman, her mind leaning towards the former. After an entire lifetime being raised on Earth as the last living Thessian, Psyis knew what human thoughts felt like. They were a blast of white noise, an unfiltered constant chatter, most times a cold-shouldering blankness during the rare moments of self-awareness. This had been a different feeling, Psyis could recall that at least. Not the white noise she was used to hearing, and so fast like a switch had been flicked. A blank or blip that had warped through her powers, not silencing them but more akin to the thing her computer did when the internet was dropping. It was just that the whole thing was over and gone before she had even pulled her mind away from her own stupid issues. Finally realizing something had passed handfuls of seconds afterwards, that inattention and time confusing Psyis now. Was it an actual thing and not her own brain messing around? Psyis considered reaching even further but decided against it as she looked at the sitting sun. The issue wasn't worth digging into, not right now at least. Especially considering it might have just been a self-inflicted problem between idle thoughts and her own powers. There was only so long until she needed to meet the Dark Duo, and time was currently at a premium. Fearform was apparently preparing to make some moves involving civilians with the help of the quiz. With both of the other heroes being tied up handling the actual fighting, Dark Squire had called Miss Psyis to run crowd control. At least it wasn't for another terrible date this time. Psyis shook the thought from her head, instead focusing on keeping her psychic awareness at its maximum while she flew on. Chastising her own wandering mind for wandering back to the same thoughts that had distracted her in the first place. That was the entire reason she had missed the blip or whatever it was. The air cracking as she left once again, mind and heart refocusing on her coming objectives and not the nonsense that might happen between completing them. Building and streets once again passing in a blur, Psyis enjoying the warmth, the protective bubble that Mac flight formed. Those apartment tower complexes and spires of business empires slowly clearing away, the land rising to give way to the mountains that had limited Voltum's sprawling growth westward. one arm lowering as Psyis began to slow, dropping down from the darkening sky in a graceful arch. The rush Psyis felt passing as she felt a familiar mind, already standing outside and waiting on her. Silver form passing over the carefully landscaped and trimmed trees of the property, Psyis looked down, seeing a young man standing outside waving up at her enthusiastically. The Thessian biting at the inside of her lip as she tried to not read into the thoughts and emotions that were spilling off of Stephen Blaine as he stood waiting for her on the balcony. Enthusiasm was the term Psyis decided she was going to stick with, not sharing in any of the same hopes and desires that washed upwards towards her. Hopes and wants not belonging to her. To patch things up? To fix things? Desires she'd only felt as idle curiosities. Stephen's thoughts already running over her and violating places she'd once given him. Patch up what? There was nothing left of the mistake they'd once been. Fix what? She'd done nothing wrong, simply not wanted to feel the way Stephen had. Desire? Psyis chewed a bit harder at that, having went round and round again with the human over her Thessian needs. Stephen was full of desires, sure for her, sure. Control was one of those she discovered underneath the more physical connections humans built in favor of her own species' mental bonds. Psyis hovering for a brief moment, looking down at the human that just hadn't worked out for her. They'd never work for one another. Stephen never changed, still that tough biker guy mentality that only hid a hurt, angry boy that never gotten over being abandoned. A piece of eye candy was all that was left, his broad shoulders stretching the leather jacket he was wearing. Muscular form filling out those denim jeans in all the right places. Stephen was a sweetly coated piece of hard candy, and just like candy he was bad for her. Psyis finding she'd been deceived by that surface, the filling being nothing but angry nights and yelling. That man turning into a boy that just didn't want help, they just wanted to be mad. Hey there sweetie PSY, Stephen tucked his hand back inside his panelled biker jacket. It wasn't all that warm, but what did that matter? He was Dark Squire, what was a little cold when you were partnered and mentored by Dark Knight. Blaine's billionaire playboy persona having rubbed off on his protege as well, Stephen braving the chill in a skin-tight shirt and open leather jacket. Stephen knew he looked damned good, even Psyis had given a slight pause. The second glance tempting him to use the term of affection he'd once granted her, though her reaction told Stephen it had been a step too far. Stephen, I've told you not to call me that anymore. Psyis came down a bit hard, her landing soft compared to the tone of her words as she continued to warn Stephen. She'd known this would happen, but she'd expected to at least have a single goon in handcuffs before the constantly cowed man started in on her. Can I have 5 minutes without you trying to drag us back months ago to when you didn't fuck up? Purple fading a bit to blue as the Thessian's anger flared out quickly, her own good conscience reminding her that it had been her choice to involve herself with this at all. In the first place, now or ever, it was something she'd signed up for. Even if the personal relationships weren't necessarily a part of that, keeping the peace in the League was. My bad, Stephen held his hands up, the false surrender simply a bait towards an argument. No, Stephen corrected himself, a talk the two needed to finish so they could end this extended break between them. Didn't realize you were strictly business now. Says the man that never takes his Psyis bit back her words as the eager spark in Stephen's eyes lit up, turning her head way, cursing at herself inside. Knowing she had only stepped onto a landmine by opening her mouth, the flood of chatter pouring out of him now only confirmed that. The white noise going 1,000 senseless noisy directions as Stephen's imagination overrode any no she could ever give him. Talking about their past, acknowledging anything Stephen ever said about them only opened the door for him to haunt her mind and heart all that much longer. An irritating poltergeist of an ex that was able to reach out to her through various means, work, their past, and his very thoughts. Even it seemed her future, as Psyis knew taking issue with Stephen would irk Dark Knight himself, her senior member on League Savior. See, you can't help yourself, Psyis, because this isn't over yet. A smirk cut across Stephen's face, Psyis' reaction simply confirming that she'd not been able to let go of their relationship. Hoping instead he could finally convince her that this was just another step, a growing pain as her little bond with him had deepened. That's how relationships work, there are ups and downs in them. Issues we're supposed to work through together, not abandon halfway. Stephen, you're still treating me like a mission. The Thessian lowered her head, white hair spilling over the right side of her purpling face. A reflection of her growing irritability at Stephen's refusal to ever not discuss this, treating her like she was something left undone. They'd already run their course, Psyis trying to remind him of that now. We're not an objective to be completed. I am not treating our arguments like some task that just comes with our relationship anymore. I'm done with that. Sometimes things just don't work out, we're one of those. Whether it's right now or forever I can't tell, so don't bother asking. Red eyes glancing through greens as Psyis answered the easily read emotions of the upset Stephen. Sighing a bit as she'd already explained this months ago, before the whole problem had begun spilling out from under that black-haired head. Yes, it's you, at least for me, you are the problem, and gods only know if you'll change the reasons why. Psyis refusing to look away, knowing her words had likely touched a nerve. The sounds of the November wind passing through the barest rustle of trim trees proved that thought right. Stephen's jacket groaning as he tried to muscle down the emotional turmoil Psyis' words had riled inside of him. Several further arguments forming, but falling short of escaping the man's mouth as he instead just bluntly tried to refute Psyis for once again stonewalling him. Still have all the answers, don't you? Stephen crossed his arms, realizing Psyis had pulled the questions from his own mind. The methods of security Stan had taught him failing, Stephen adjusted his tactics, filling his mind with their shared past. I know I'm not perfect, but what we had was special, Psyis. I want us back. It was Stephen. I'm glad we had it. Psyis looked out towards the trees, wondering if Stephen would have been better off without the same carefully manicured appearance. That had been what had fooled her in the first place after all, turning her eyes back towards the talking deception in front of her. But I'm not here to talk about us. Yeah, I know. Stephen nodded along dumbly, zero intent to actually let the chance disappear while Psyis was around. It wasn't like he could fly down to Centropolis to talk about them, though the idea had crossed his mind before. Instead of recalling how many times Head thought of opening the hatch and taking the dark jet, Stephen kept his thoughts on the balcony door. Let's get out of the cold. Stan's in the cavern, but we've got time to grab a bite if Jenkins has made anything. If not, we can whip something up really quick. Okay, Psyis agreed, tentatively, not wanting to already start causing issues with her co-worker for the next foreseeable period. Quickly adding in an addendum as Stephen's ideas washed over her. I'm not that hungry though, so just a quick snack. Both giving a slight shiver as they stepped into the expensive and now geothermally warmed mansion the Blaines had once built. The family keeping the property through generations of maintenance long enough, the land had earned the mansion the title of manor. Recognition for the lifetimes the family had dedicated itself to Voltum, either through business or heroism, sometimes a combination of both. Those effort paying off as the sitting room around her even smelled rich, the aromas of stained wood, aged rows of books, and the slightest hint of pomp. Red eyes glancing across the sitting room, its only exit towards the hall, one direction bringing her closer to her real objective. The other would keep the peace a bit longer even if it was insulting to her. As well as misleading, as Stephen was just too dense to accept her decision, her giving way was only ever going to be seen as him gaining ground back with her. Not as Psyis simply accepting Stephen's childish intentions so he didn't throw a fit or cause an incident during a mission. Eat something, Stephen refuted, blocking Psyis from heading towards the grandfather clock that held the entrance to the dark cavern. Extending his arms towards the kitchens where he knew Jenkins hadn't prepared anything at Stephen's own request. You know it's not good to go on a mission hungry. Stephen smiled warmly, gesturing with the extended and blocking arm down the beautifully carpeted hall. Finally dropping his arm as Psyis walked down towards the kitchens, stepping in quickly alongside her. The moment reminding him for a second of when they'd both been in the Young Saviors, hanging out while she'd still been learning her powers. Cooking again was something Stephen could use to rekindle those old feelings, glad that Psyis had listened to him. It was best for the man to take the lead in a relationship after all. Psyis didn't bother saying anything else as Stephen once again shoved her words aside, only caring about what he thought, wishing she couldn't read his thoughts. Slipping past him, careful not to appear too intimate, though judging by his flaring emotions the attempt had failed. Stephen's attempts at chivalry and care falling short as the psychic could read fully into his depths of control. Not for the first time wishing she'd just been an average human woman, unaware and blissfully ignorant of Stephen's hidden darkness. Maybe someday she'd find someone different or feel like she actually had a choice. The Raven's Basilisk. Chapter 4. The moment things began to change. An odd silence stretched out across a few Voltum blocks, absent from the usual nightly noise. No angry yelling followed by a gunshot that echoed in silence, no sounds of gangs riling in the alleys, not even the lost echo of a car alarm reached up to the top of the multi-story tower where the yellow-hooded figure stood. Its form constantly moving about as if it couldn't quite settle, as irritable as a flag tossing in the winds it would share at such an altitude. Izime tugged at his hood, a bit frustrated with his time in Voltum already, and it had literally only been hours. Not even a full day passing, and this whole trip was looking like bad luck waiting to happen. The original plan had forecast a slew of comparatively minor nefarious plots, a few random acts of moderate villainy. Something well within the realm of reason for the dark duo, and something Izime had been looking forward to profiting from. A few nights of gathering leftover traps and devices crafted by some of the most capable and creative minds. Not sound minds, but hot damn were they capable and creative. It should have been easy picking, now was there an entire extra hero involved. That started tipping the scales to a larger plot that involved multiple unpredictable elements, one of which it was now a psychic. The match-up here was a potential disaster in the making, not just for Izime's wallet, but the people of Voltum as a whole. If it was just Stephen and Stan getting the shit kicked out of them, whoop-dee-I-do. The psychic couldn't get involved, she was the riskiest element in this powder keg of villainy and heroism tonight. Her powers dwarfed those of all but the true titans such as Radiation Man, Voidside, and Vinos. It wasn't like any of those heavy hitters were here. The quiz wasn't so bad even if every damned room had been trapped and rigged in a truly intricate problem to solve. Some of those devices had very handy components, other could and would be sold as is. Especially those multi-activation cable throwers that the duo of dinguses kept setting off. Izime a bit disappointed in the simple single-track approach both of the two better trained but technologically gifted heroes were taking. The trick was knowing that the lasers they emitted were actually the third in a series of activators. Every time one of them spoke up or pointed them out, it would trigger either the noise or motion sensors. The number of civilians tied up by them should have been a bit of a clue. Izime wasn't in the thick of it though, so he didn't want to judge too much. They could even be the more advanced version that detected radio signals, though such intricate traps would be blind firing with all the electronics going off in the building, so Izime doubted it. The big problem was Fear Form, the toxin-using exosuit-wearing mixed-class villain. Dude was already an imposing physical fighter for most basic-level heroes, with that enhanced exoskeleton supporting his body. The big danger was his reliance on using and abusing the environment with that fear toxin. The exhaust pipes on the back could and certainly would gas out the area if the villain encountered the psychic her. As it would not only amp Fear Form's own physical abilities, it also was a massive hazard for the Thessian, a wonderful prize for Izime though. The sickly yellow substance sold like hotcakes though in either liquid or gas form. It was just the issue of safely handling and dismantling those devices. The dude was basically inoculated to his own stash, so any devices Fear Form designed were designed shoddily on purpose. The man simply didn't care how much toxin was wasted as long as the job was done at the end of the night. As such, tampering with them was risky, and even if it didn't really affect Izime the same, it did give him some nasty flashbacks. Those and the instant nausea that caused vomiting was bad when you were wearing a gas mask, and something he'd rather avoid. Those problems were later issues and considerations about what's, not a who. The who he was really worried about was the superpowered mind that might level a few Volton blocks before her friends brought her down. Give Miss Psyis a solid dose of that toxin and everyone in Volton would probably get rocked by the fallout. Either through mental influencing or as the alien simply lost her wits and battles a nightmare that didn't exist, either possible as her powers went rampant. God knows what the overpowered Thessian could conjure up from her darkest depths. It wasn't a question Izime wanted answered. Kneeling a bit lower, Izime tried to focus his vision a better. The odd zoom he had gained since fully bonding with Cradle last year was a bit hard to manage with a simple human brain. The thermal, magnetic, and night vision were all a simple on-off thought. Focusing was a bit more complex, resolution resolving a literal headache sometimes. The figure floating in her silver suit across the large Volton block came in just fine. The odd blink-Y thing that was strapped on the AC duct between them wasn't coming in any better at all. It was either the unit right in front of the one he wanted to look at or the whole roof behind. Even the AR interactive sliders weren't helping. Izime having given up on the mental dials he had been using a while ago in favor of physically moving his hands over invisible buttons and bars. Cradle usually helped him manage some of these things, either supplying a video feed or adjusting Izime's human binocular vision on its own. Right now, however, the Raven was inside the building on another run. There were some routes the quiz had rigged that Dark Knight hadn't taken and most likely wouldn't. Those rigged halls Cradle was going into and cleaning, gathering any traps and devices in a corner where Izime could quickly snap in and snatch them. Hopefully all in one breath. Izime didn't want to lose the little bit of conbeans he had eaten earlier, those were his last ones after all. Izime tried to focus once again, this time ignoring the thingy on the AC duct and instead observing the only person who might compromise him at the moment. That stupid purple alien from Centropolis had showed up earlier, and as excited as Cradle was, Izime wasn't. Now she was across from him, the two separated by the building that took up the corner of the block. The alien, hell any psychic, was a massive threat to his existence. If anyone asked the right questions and found out his original purpose, well, that was the reason for having rules. Izime had only a few rules in his line of work, the very thin ass line he walked reselling and reusing hero and villain stuffs in his personal grey markets. One very big one was no psychics. None, nada, not a damned one. They could ruin his whole shtick and empty every storehouse he had made across the world, let alone the things they might learn about him and his home reality. There were some other obvious ones, like not taking the side of a hero or a villain, as that would bring its own can of worms. Essentially, the whole gig remained around not being a direct part of the whole hero-villain system here on Earth. He was just there for their stuff. The stuff, however, was starting to look like a complicated bit of operating. Various simulations on the ways this might play are running through Izime's mind. It was a bit too late to change plans now, even if there was something and a someone on the outside of the building. Abandoning the hall was a hard loss to accept, as both he and Cradle needed this run. They had just invested all their Earth cash into Wesson's family, and things were going to get rough otherwise. The two needed cash to at least get them through the new year, unless they wanted to risk influencing the Earth's economy with laundered soul credits. The game was set, the moves had been made, and the loot was now waiting. Izime having essentially pre-committed to making this finally year-end run through Volton profitable, backing them into this corner. Cradle was already inside at work and would be demanding its ram regardless of any trouble. Izime kept his eyes on Trouble, watching as she slowly lowered herself to the roof across the block. The glow emanating from her body ruffling her white hair against the breeze. Just focus on the building and the people. Izime muttered while mentally speaking into the bonded connection with Cradle. Be quick, we have company purple. Yes, yes. Money, money, 12 tricks. 25 more. Floor to floor. Izime nodded, the connection easily making sense of what Cradle was intending to translate in much more detail. Information it had collected on the alien nearly crowding Izime's vision until he mentally shoved the windows aside. The bigger interest was the small pile of tricks Cradle had prepared for the two of them to steal from the quiz. The intelligent villain had a knack for making some of the best non-lethal ensnaring devices the galaxy had ever seen, perfect for the odd men-limbed alien out drunk running on their bounty. Money, money. Izime whispered as he smiled a bit wider, one hand rubbing at his still empty pockets in excitement. The other still raised, poised for a snap and grab of their current haul in case things went badly. Finally closing the tabs Cradle had raised to review the alien's information, instead quietly observing her from the darkness. Red eyes moving about as she was still focused on the building, and that blurry blinky duct was still. Izime swallowed dryly. Where the fuck had a holeless AC duct just disappeared too? Pulse quickening, Izime tried to keep his calm simply, so his eyes retained their focus. Knowing from previous experience nerves and emotional responses would only cause instability in the more advanced functions. Checking the areas of the stacked flat verticals on apartment complex, he could see the edges of the stepped stories bare of any flashing lights. Eyes finally settling back on the psychic, Izime's nerves fraying just a bit further as he stared intently. If he couldn't see anything, odds where she would be finding out what that device was before he did. Izime standing and preparing to intervene, his decision made without question. Simply not willing to risk the devices Cradle had gathered, the money the two needed, or the psychic harming the people in the city. His fears coming to life before his eyes as a thick yellow plume exploded towards her, red eyes going wide as the Thessian blued out in terror. On the other roof a few minutes earlier. Psyis held her hands out, unaware of her observer, focused on pouring more of her energy out. Carefully trying to manage all the different pieces of the puzzle she was currently juggling. Supporting not only the psychic shields that were keeping the entire skyscraper full of civilians calmly frozen in place. There was also an entire skyscraper full of fear toxin that had been released, her shields keeping the rough structure airtight as well. White cape fluttering as the wind and her own powers both tried to rule its direction. Psyis took a deep breath, feeling the scales of her suit pull as her lungs filled. Tonight was just the start of what was looking to be a complicated game of cat and mouse, and more time dealing with Steven. The heroine much more content to focus on keeping the parts per million of fear toxin to a minimum than considering her previously toxic relationship. Both of them, Steven and herself, had far bigger issues than the burnt bridge of intimacy between them. Fear form and the quiz had taken over a massive apartment complex, the multi-story tower now turned into a terrifying madhouse of difficult-to-solve questions and civilians that had been driven into a terrified and terrifying frenzy. Dark Knight and Dark Squire currently going through the trials the quiz had laid out for them, testing their strength and guile. Psyis tried to check in on their progress. A small sliver of that energy breaking away to trigger her communicator. Psyis contacted Dark Squire. I'm keeping the crowd under control, but we need to find the source of fear form psychosis gas quickly, Squire. The pressure in the building's going to build up eventually, and I'm a sitting duck out here. Worksing SSN it PSY. Dark Squire's voice came between mic cracks and static, Psyis eyebrows furrowing as she tried to make sense of why exactly Steven's communication was coming back broken. There was no mention of her own transmission being misheard or any signs that the other end had the same issue. An odd interference coming from the concrete? No, that was a stupid idea, Psyis deducing the sounds of hissing weren't because of faulty tech or a disrupted connection. The building was quite likely being flooded still with the toxic fumes, so that explained the hissing, but those odd pops in the radio speaker, the microsecond gaps where nothing was coming through at all? We don't have time for this, Dark Squire, I'm pulling all the food. Psyis responded, trying to detail her plan until a snap from her earpiece told her that her line had just been overridden by the control channel. Okay, so her and Dark Squire's line hadn't been private, maybe that was it. Miss Psyis, you can't control that much gas and the people at the same time. Another voice cut into the comm, focus on your job and save these civilians from fear form, rushing things will play us right into the quiz's plan. Psyis giving a half-lidded gaze towards the building where her senior league member had decided to chime in, Stan's tone brooking no arguments. He was stepping in as Dark Knight, it was his city and his mission after all. Though Psyis felt as if she was still being treated as a member of the young league, not the woman he'd voted to join him. Sometimes wondering if she was just a pawn to use, keeping Steven's worst tendencies reined in when Dark Squire operated alone. Affirmative, Dark Knight. Psyis tried to calm down, the situation wasn't collapsing by any means, so there wasn't any real reason to get drastic and really flex her powers here in Voltum. There were just some odd things going on today, first odd sense earlier and now this oddity on Dark Knight's premium tech. Unknown in her own psychic senses, might just be a personal hiccup, she was learning to use her Thessian powers alone. The oddity of a similar blip in Dark Knight's tech on the same day? That couldn't be a coincidence. If it was just unsettling, and Psyis had to admit, it had gotten to her. The heroine unsure if she should admonish herself or trust that sense. Psyis glanced at the darkness around her, the starless smog that plagued Voltum giving no skyline to check the roof lines against. Her eyes glancing instead to the few lit windows under them, checking for any odd movements. The sounds of Voltum filled the air, the same city with its gently steaming sewers as it ever was. Nerves tightening, it wasn't though. It was too quiet, too still. Psyis' gut was telling her to pay more attention to absolutely everything because there was something. It had slipped her grasp this evening and her soul told her it was here again, instincts flaring at the unknown in the blackness. The feeling that she had missed something earlier had never stopped for a second. Alien senses blazing, she had been missing it since entering Voltum tonight, but it certainly hadn't missed them. The blip in her powers, the radio, it all confirmed there was something else here. Even though she had no goosebumps, she could feel her blue mottling spreading, darkening her colors. Wesson biology trying to hide on instinct, blending within the darkness to hide from the predator unseen. Preparing another psychic sweep, Psyis ran one hand through her hair, making sure to keep the other up and focusing her powers on the building. What the hell could there even be in Voltum that could possibly work her up, let alone actually scare her? A twisted clown? Please, laughing man was lucky Dark Knight had ordered she not just wipe that crooked brain clean. An oversized wrestler? She was a psychic telepathic telekinetic who could go at least 2 rounds with the likes of Voidside, let alone some synthroid addict. Quickly focusing her own powers inward, Psyis decided to find the answer to her worries. Searching to see if she still had any part of her mental focus, that psychic energy occupied elsewhere. Praying there were still some reserves, the alien found herself disappointed. There weren't any, all of her powers were focused here. Okay, fine. Psyis thought to herself, it would be a smaller sweep. The mental ping would be underpowered but still sweep most of the nearby city blocks. The little weakening in the building's airtight shield wouldn't matter that much, a few parts per million were acceptable ranges of leaked fear toxin to be released in an already polluted city. With a simple pulse, she had the answer to her worries, there was nothing. Psyis sighed, relaxing her hand and letting it fall by her side. Running her mind over the feelings her psychic echo had brought back. The familiar walls of cheap apartments, the forms of the people inside unaware. There was nothing out of place, everything was as it should be because she had realized what to look for at first. Nearly letting the whole thing go when she finally saw it. Instincts nearly falling to silent sleep until an ice-cold bucket of fear came washing over them. Psyis was tensing again but now being very careful not to react too obviously as she repeated the same pulse. That same mental echo returning that same form. There was a literal nothing, a void, a blank in her mental blueprint across the block from her on the roof. An oddly sifting but recognizable shape, bipedal, and it was facing her. Red eyes doubling their focus on the building in front of her. If she was being watched, just looking might give away, and whoever it was seemed to be prepared for her powers. There was an uncomfortable mental silence coming from that area, no thoughts or emotions seeping out. The sensation unnerving the psychic even further, she'd thought she'd recognize it even if it was one of the odder aliens, a demon, hell even Voidside himself. She would at least recognize it, they all shared similar patterns. Wants, needs, desires could be felt if not thoughts directly interpreted. Even if it was one of her own specifically trained enemies, Psyis knew she should at least be able to identify the methods of camouflage. This wasn't even an attempt, it was just a void that was taking her psychic powers and erasing them completely. It wasn't stealth, it was a flat denial of sensing that had only keyed her off because it was breaking the rules of what she knew. The form clearly an unknown that was manipulating or avoiding her own powers in ways she couldn't even identify. Shit. Psyis thought about switching lines to contact Jenkins for an extra hand, but even then she might just be directly revealing that they were all compromised. Besides, what was the butler going to do? Well, he was ex-special forces. That would still draw Dark Knight's attention away from the actual civilians, which might be exactly what that void wanted, Psyis intent on not falling into any traps like the two inside. No, it was better if she took matters into her own hands. Psyis, we've got some movement here. Dark Squire's voice came back into her ear, everything clear outside? Sorry, Psyis replied on instinct, returning both her hands to their positions. Her power washing back over the skyscraper in full, restoring the locking forces to the few civilians that had started to free themselves from her protective grasp. That nothing flickering out from under her mental detection as her attention was drawn away. We're good, Psyis triggered her MIC this time, trying to think of some way to inform the two without causing alarm. It's a very clear night outside, still something I can't see though. Maybe she could. Psyis began to reach out, not with a sweep this time. Her hand physically making a grasping motion, the locking mental force slipping off that nothing like it was slicked with oil. A bit more power? Maybe if she'd had still known its exact position, then her snare wouldn't have slipped off it so uselessly. Psyis. Dark Knight's voice came directly this time, the electronically altered rasp nearly peaking her earpiece as the growl came across full of emotion. Psyis immediately throwing the issue of their watcher aside, mind returned to the civilians that were beginning to escape her control. Preparing to redouble her efforts and avoid Dark Knight's ire with an explanation. At least Psyis thought it had been Dark Knight calling to reprimand her again. So when she returned her focus to the skyscraper wanting to redouble her efforts and instead saw a cloud of fear forms toxin billowing out towards her, Psyis panicked for a brief moment. Having missed whatever device had deployed the toxic fumes while her attention was on that void, distracted by their new company. now unsure where her power would be best applied and in what order to attack this new issue. Was there a hole in the building all of a sudden? Surely the daring duo hadn't actually triggered one of the quiz's more intricate and much larger traps, causing some kind of damage. That left an exterior trap, but Psyis had personally checked the surrounding buildings and they had been clear. Had been, just like she'd thought the rooftops nearby had been clear as well. Did that thing deploy Fearform's device? Don't breathe. They rigged a vent so it would blast you. Dark Squire's voice came back over the com, giving obvious advice. Psyis quickly sorting the information Stephen had spilled in that message, her mind not feeling any of the emotional worry he was. Just a bit of raw panic as she'd been caught unaware, that and the unsettling fear from the void. Still, those were secondary concerns at the moment. Feeling with her mind, Psyis located the vent in question. Nearly midway up the building on an exterior platform designed for AC units, there was one directed towards her, blasting the stream yellowish gaseous toxin her direction. I've got this, guys. Psyis turned one of her hands, the cloud being too large to bubble up at this point, so her normal method would be useless. Instead, she waved her palm in a circle, forcing the air to whip itself into a current with psychokinesis, driving the cloud into the upper atmosphere where it could begin to disperse harmlessly, quickly reaching between the building's shield and keeping the current of air whippings upwards from the Voltum Street below, gathering any bits that leaked while still holding the civilians inside safely, accomplishing what Dark Knight had deemed impossible for her. Psyis smiling confidently, though an uneasy breath did escape her, knowing full well she had nearly been caught completely unaware, brows furrowing as she focused her attention on the device that had caused the spray. Her eyes widening a bit as she saw tendrils of toxin beginning to slip around her whirlwind. Maybe Dark Knight had a bit of a point after all? Drawing an even larger base for the whirlwind with her hand before looking back to see if she had caught the excess flow, only to find that the leaking tendril of yellow had reached out further. The cloud too large to see around now, she instead reached out and felt with her mind wanting to just crush the device. She could handle the cloud that poured out afterwards and add it to the current street tornado. She needed to handle the actual thing producing the gas now though. The AC duct was gone? No, that nothing was blocking her from it. Psyis held a hand over her mouth as the toxin crept further and faster around the whirlwind, carried by natural air reacting to her own forced currents. Those reaching threads slowing until they began to get sucked back into the no longer growing vortex of toxin. Blue hand slowly falling away, Psyis realizing the tendril had lost its strength, no longer having the supply to wash out of the mini tornado she'd made. Psyis reaching out quickly wanting to make her move, but that nothing just literally vanished under her power's very gaze. Disappearing under her own power's gaze and grasp as if it had never existed or as if she'd tried to snag Fazpaz. The AC duct actually physically missing this time, that hand faltering under the weight of worry and questions. That would explain why the toxin had begun to draw back instead of flood around her containment. Without the main supply, nothing remained to saturate the surrounding air. Finally, visually glancing at the trap building where it had last been, the obvious signs of the duct being forcefully removed were clear from the sparking wires and still dripping evaporation lines. Still, why had it taken the trap? Hadn't it been the one to deploy it in the first place? Just in time, Miss Psyis. Dark Knight's voice came back through the comm, the slight pause between making the compliment more pointed. Glad to see you still have things under control. Let's get this pop quiz finished, you two. Psyis ignored a backhanded mention of her earlier lack of attention, instead urging to two onward as she finally delivered the news into her comm. We are not alone and it's an unknown complete ghost. Not quite willing to admit that her once purple, now probably blue, but might have just been pulled from the frying pan. Fearform's multiple attacks having clearly just stressed the upper limits of her abilities between shielding and manipulating the air to avoid that attack. Psyis instead requested to two finish, directly informing them of their unexpected company, hoping the lack of details convinced them both to start moving a bit quicker, as it wasn't just a simply request anymore. Repeat last. Dark Knight's growl came back just as tense as she felt. Psyis wondering if it was that odd interference returning on their end now or if Dark Knight actually doubted her as he tried to clarify. Confirm, we have a hostile? I only displaced that gas. Psyis was torn between wanting some extra eyes and the civilians actually in danger, giving it a bit more grace than she'd have liked. The device that caused it is gone and there was a thing watching me earlier. If you're under ATT, Stephen worried voice came through as if he had forgotten Psyis was holding a conversation with the two right at this moment and hadn't cleared the line. The click as her communicator was overridden, telling Psyis exactly where she stood, somewhere under the two who'd asked for help. Psyis rolling her eyes as her earpiece clicked again, Dark Knight giving her the right over Squire now as well. No, Squire. Like I was saying, it only watched, and I think it took Fearform's trap. Civilians should still remain our priority, they're the mission. The alien kept a distance from the human's tone, replying with a no-nonsense tone. May have just been an underling, some new goon trying to recover experimental device. Psyis didn't even believe her own words. That void hadn't been anything close to a goon or any other creature she'd even encountered on Earth in her near entire lifetime spent on the large wet rock. Not at all surprised when Dark Knight's voice came back, already speaking sense though it was without the same unnerving detail she'd felt. Those gas units are pretty common. A bit higher flow and much more compact, but fear form's got thousands of them. Stay sharp. Dark Knight's offered his own view on Psyis' thoughts. Keep your senses sweeping, use your metal powers to find the target. I am okay, Psyis replied, a bit tensely to her senior member who was still treating her like a teen hero learning the ropes. Psyis detailing what she had learned so far, hoping Dark Knight would be a bit more helpful finding a solution with more information. This thing is hard for me to find, it's absorbing my powers or something. I only sensed it because I realized there was a gap in my sense, it's burning a hole in my detection ability. You didn't see it take the trap? Dark Squire asked, not aware of just how far Psyis had nearly had the situation slip out of control from inside. Never even being aware of the massive funnel of fear toxin that had been sent towards the sky. No, I think it's gone though, and so is that trap. Psyis shook her head at the unhelpful addition as she gave another shot at sweeping the far rooftop. Finding nothing out of place on any of the surrounding buildings, no reason to sweep a building she was currently shielding, she continued to press for a quick resolution. Let's save the night and wrap this up, guys. We may have a new friend, Dark Knight growled a dire warning, quickly making a few decisions to ensure optimal security. Or something worse. We'll meet debrief tonight, Miss Psyis, you stay with us if we're being tracked. Friends say hi, Psyis agreed with the warning, relaying the results of her psychic touch, a bit regretful she'd be stuck with Steven. Though she was certainly appreciative of having a secure location to base away from whatever that thing was. I couldn't even get a thought out of that thing, so it's definitely not a human, or maybe not even organic. You're not good against a physical opponent, Dark Squire's tense voice came back over the comm once again, the young League member interrupting his two senior heroes once more. Do you need backup? She's fine, Squire, and like Miss Psyis said, we have civilians that need us here. She knows how to sense it now, so try trusting her this time. Dark Knight reined in his sidekick's overprotective nature with a pointed reminder of his past failures in dealing with the woman. Now stepping in to address Psyis, try and advise the fellow League member on alternative methods, how she might fight. If you can't fight it directly, use your surroundings. A telekinetically thrown brick isn't a psychic attack, it's a brick. Affirmative, throw bricks. Psyis didn't want to point out that her method was only useful in finding it quickly after comparing two pulses in quick succession. Let alone how idiotic it sounded to resort to throwing stones. As powerful as she was, she could easily and quickly create an entire boulder to hurl at someone, let alone grabbing a brick. The problem was the time between her mental blips would easily let it escape just like it had now, let alone aim to do damage. Psyis sighing audibly as she felt nothing but a lack of control. She needed these two to hurry so she could quickly use her full powers to sweep all of Voltum for her new friend. Time, however, would pass slowly and furiously against them. Hours passed as wires were cut defusing the bombs. Questions found their answers, which slowly turned down the amount of toxin being released. The drain on Psyis' powers slacking enough that she finally dared to reach out and check the state of the buildings around her. It was exactly how it should have been any other day of the week, but she had the odd feeling she was missing something again. The roofs, the buildings, they were all coming in crystal clear. No blanks, gaps or holes that might indicate that thing was actively moving. Instinct still itching and now more willing to listen, Psyis quickly flipped her ping to a skyward radar sweep, swallowing as she found a cloud? No. She pinged again, the form quickly seemed to have recondensing into a mass that wasn't exactly solid, just a void. It was the same hole, or another one of the same creatures, just a different shape. The thing mimicking a bird now before clouding, once again vanishing so fast it was as if it had found a gap between her own thoughts. Form and feeling disappearing like a dream that couldn't be kept upon waking. She'd known she'd seen it, had it, but it was gone now all the same. Swallowing, she risked a glance, looking through the clouds expecting to see something but finding only black. Not even stars, the light pollution and smog of Voltum too thick to allow the night sky to shine on its dark nature. The night dragged on until the sun was starting to poke over the horizon, the final police car pulling away and the last ambulance leaving for Voltum General Hospital. Normally the noted Miss Psyis would have joined the daring duo in relaying the happenings of tonight's incident to Commissioner Grigg. Instead, the alien was sweeping the entire city, the skies above, and even the areas below. Finally coming up with a plan, or at least a concept of what this thing might be able to do. Returning to Blaine Manor to discuss their options and rest for the morning in her own provided room in an empty wing. Glad to have made progress in not only tracking that void, but also in avoiding any chance of Steven dragging her into an argument or reliving their past in some stupid regretful night. The Raven's Basilisk. Chapter 5. It was just problem solving. Izime swallowed back his nausea. Narrowly avoiding the blast of fumes had been easy. Grabbing that stupid rigged AC duct and all 25 of those traps in one breath had in fact been as impossible as he'd originally feared. The filters on the civilian model gas mask only serving to keep more of the fear-inducing toxins in with him. That and beans, so many beans. Thank God woo no, oh no, nope, here it comes. Izime's muffled voice tried to sound enthusiastic as he slammed a depleted power brick onto the side of the duct. not even waiting to see if the teeth had fully bitten into the trapped unit, turning as soon as he'd felt the last bit of the in his stomach start jumping towards his throat. Failing miserably in his battle to keep down his meal, Izime doubled over, retching just as the brick activated. The sounds of the power brick whirring away mixing with the sounds of a stomach heaving wetly. Regretting nearly everything about tonight, Izime quickly yanked the mask off, letting what little remained of the beans from earlier find the sidewalk. The rest slipping from the mask in thick chunks, some still stuck inside as the rest had been since he snagged Cradle's haul. Finally finishing the dry heaving, Izime thought to himself as a familiar empty cramp hit his stomach, the pain from the muscle clenching on the nothing that remained, not from hunger. Next would be a week or two of terrible nightmares, but thankfully Izime knew he'd never go insane like a regular person, needing treatment as doctors administered a concoction of cures. What is there to be scared of anyway? I've already seen the worst. With a nod, Izime stood back up and swept his yellow coat out of the way, kicking at the AC duct. Watching as a final few coughs of fumes came out. Frowning only for a moment as he considered how he had just wasted that precious toxin both on the power brick and in his frustration. His worries about money and resources for bettering himself always at the forefront as if it had been programmed into Izime. Thank God for advanced alien technology. Izime smiled a bit brighter, glad that the dead alien power brick he had slammed onto the trap had gained at least a quarter charge from the wasted toxin. Any remaining chemicals outside of the toxin likely being used as some kind of fuel to create that charge as well. Various coolants such as any freon in the unit, along with whatever had powered the damn trap fearform had stuffed inside the thing. Izime shuddered at the thought of what might have happened if he hadn't snagged the deceptive moving unit before it had blasted that stupid purple heroine. Sure, Miss Psyis had handled the initial jet, but it wasn't ever just going to stop with that one blast. This was fearform, the dude worked in layers and was probably testing just how far he could stress her powers. Checking to see just how high of a cliff he could push the Centropolis angel from into the depths of hell. The crazy psycho wanted his victims to sink into that pit, and Izime knew what that hole was like. He'd spent a life managing human fear, desire, and 1,000 other things. Overpowered psychic sessions had not been on that list, however, Izime letting the final shudders of worry work their way out as he thought about the bluing alien. Hopefully she was a bit more on guard now that she'd been scared, would be aware of her own limits just like he was. Izime personally doubting the psychic could have pulled herself free if she had caught a full dose, so he'd had to intervene. There was simply no other choice. It would remain a grey area in his rulebook now as far as he was concerned. The no psychics rule was a very important rule. Damned important rule. However, it sat well below the brand new and no fear toxin crazed psychics rule. One Izime had decided to create even after that single half-second of reconsideration where he'd thought about just leaving. The people there would have suffered, and that wasn't something Izime could stomach. He'd seen enough human suffering already. So, with a snap, Izime had went over and yanked the damned thing. That technically gave him one favor he'd never call in from the world's best psychic, a batch of toxin to sell, and best yet was the free charge. This thing's too big, Cradle. Izime glanced at his companion who was still admiring its collected pile of traps taken from the quiz. Let's cut the fat out. Cradle looked over at the very messy Izime, cocking its head before hopping off its hoard with bit less enthusiasm than Izime had. The cheap aluminum wasn't that tasty, not as tasty as the precious metals in those tasty chips back in the saw. The box was kind of big though, so with a flourish of its wings, Cradle sent a few feathers to reduce various parts of the scrap to their base atomic components. The blades of the guide feathers tearing deep into the softer grey before dissolving both. The black edges biting before melting into themselves and the AC duct both. The nanits chewing and dissolving until the entire thing was reduced to the core prize. It had taken Cradle a few years to get the right combo before Izime had consistently praised it. Now attempting for its own version of truly perfect results as it attempted to preserve and remold the base atomic structures. Cradle aware that the failed iterations of this method had reduced some big money to nanoprocess slag. Cradle was fully reducing the metals, plastics, and carbons down to their individual parts. Taking pieces of atoms to form molecules, creating more elements to perfect its form. Processing things down further to such a degree, to the subatomic level, was still a bit tricky though, so bits of the slag fizzled and sparked. The raven cocking its own head as it pecked at the tiny crystalline towers that formed, learning from its bond to reuse and perfect every method it could. Even these failures could be studied and reproposed elsewhere eventually. The two cleaning away the comparatively useless parts that Cradle was still unsure of, carefully removing the more often Earth-used components that made the actual air conditioner function. Piling bits of Fearform's actual trap next to them in just a few minutes. Various pipes and tiny pumps that had worked in tandem to create a massive plume of an attack. The tiny micro-motors working in unison to move absurdly vast quantities of air for their size. Afterwards Izime had to take a few snaps around town. Blinking into various alleys around Voltum was a bit risky, but he had stashed a few other things. Tools of the trade for breaking down some of the more common villains' goods were stashed in various abandoned areas less prone to the sewers rusting. Each carefully selected by Cradle because they belonged to very well-established villains such as Laughing Man and the drug-fueled Wrestler Crusher. It was just a matter of keeping track of Voltum realty and picking spots that would see zero development, a rather easy simulation to run. That, and not getting shot, which was a bit harder to simulate in Voltum. Izime wasn't too worried though, that's what the vest was for. Besides, if Crusher did get his hands on him, Izime figured he could snap out of it, that or ask Cradle to help. Even the Dark Knight himself wasn't that big of an issue, not when you could jump 5 stellar system away in a second. Worst came to it, he might just hide away in hell for a bit. Not many that had come looking for him there. Finally, Izime arrived back at his hideout, exhausted from running around all night after saving that stupid purple woman. Cradle and himself finally having a break from jumping around and recovering their tools. Giving a slight nod towards their roommate, the one least talkative of the three whom Izime had decided to name Big Skeleton, he promptly dropped the haul into its bony lap. Izime would start the process of reassembly as well, checking the integrity of the traps that Dark Knight had set off. The rest were still prime and ready, just disarmed. Those required nothing but a sail, the rest could wait until after his nap. Scan? Cradle hopped from its shelf to the box, glancing between the door and their first haul from Voltum. Sleep, you eat, Cradle. Izime shook his head while he brushed at his friend's strangely soft metallic tendrils of metallic down under the larger bladed feathers. More work tomorrow. Fully confident that Cradle would never cut him on purpose, trusting enough to even dig in a bit to tickle. The grayed mechanical legs hopping back a bit as the tech raven cawed in protest, the finger disturbing the bits of memory chips stored in its gullet. A gently soft snapping poke of its beak teasing its bond back. Izime turned back towards the spring bed and adjusted the blankets properly this time, keeping the softer quilts on top so they wouldn't snag the rusty springs. Rolling the empty duffel bag up for a bit of a pillow. Finally, content with his bed for the morning, he glanced at the light that was still burning away and then at the power brick. Doing a bit of quick math told him it would last a few years powering a single bulb. Still no sense in wasting it though. Izime finished cleaning up the bit he could, swatting at a cobweb with an old shirt before putting the box back on its shelf. Glancing at the third empty one, thinking about where he would ask Cradle to cut the long metal arms. A little work desk wouldn't hurt for when he was dismantling those little gifts from the quiz. 6 hours down, topside to do some busking. Oh, not in Voltum, that's a bad idea. Izime pulled out the old flip phone, giving Cradle a brief side-eye watching that hungry beak. Quickly setting an alarm before the Raven decided to try the forbidden snack, Izime laid out their plans. I'll just tear down those, and then we see if we can snag some of Dark Knight's toys, just as long as stupid Purple has left by then. Izime narrowed his eyes, reconsidering his plan, torn between getting his hands on some of the comparatively rarer gear Dark Knight often left behind. It was a tempting opportunity, though the villain's goods were certainly the more steady money. Izime snorting a bit as he realized he wasn't really reconsidering anything, simply assessing the risks of moving on the hero's goods. If he stuck to simply collecting the villain's things this time around, it should be that much of an issue to avoid the three heroes while they did their thing. Stupid Purple? Cradle cocked its head, not sure it would consider the Thessian stupid. Her scans were harder to avoid than Dark Knight's had been, that was certain. Those non-electronic based powers were far harder to avoid and nearly impossible to falsify, Cradle only able to mask their forms with nanits. Thankfully their mental bond kept the psychic from so easily joining the two-way call, Izime and Cradle's comfort making the line nearly untappable. Miss Psyis the alien, Izime waved his hand idly in explanation to Cradle's tone. That was a lot of gas, and she had no actual protection, zero, and still showed. Didn't she know she was facing fear form? She had to, so yeah, that's a stupid move. Izime considered the way the Thessian had acted last night, floating around just looking like a prime target for a cloud of toxin. At least that had landed before Fearform had activated the thing from wherever he'd been watching, though that certainly hadn't solved the real problem. All she'd needed to do was ask Dark Squire or Dark Knight for a gas filter before leaving. Not a damned hard thing to do, right? Izime had even brought his as useless as it was. It was best to play it safer than not after all, right? Though he hadn't really played it safe moving to save Hino, no, he'd just solved a problem is all. Izime shook the thought from his head, quickly glad to hear Cradle's cawing, looking up with a smile encouraging the bird to distract him further. Stupid Purple. Cradle cawed in agreement, lifting its head to give a throaty if mechanical chortle. Cocking its head and repeating the cry a few more times as it validated the points Izime had made in its own mind. What's her new name? Izime gave a teasing wiggle of his brows, egging the bird on further, watching as Cradle's raven brain attached their own name to the Centropolis celebrity. It'd probably be something the bird would never forget, for however long they both lived, so someday they could both look back on this moment and laugh. Stupid. Cradle flapped its wings, calling proudly, fluffing itself proudly as it understood Izime was renaming the alien. Placing the two of them well above her in the scheme of raven things, it finished the name just as loudly. Purple. Ha ha. Izime laughed, rocking back a bit, glad to feel the revelry filling his bond as they joked, she sure is buddy. Its nest program was right, that was awfully stupid of her, Cradle refocusing its digital gaze on Izime affectionately. He was right on most things, and even if wrong, his views were valid when seen from the right perspective. The tech raven nodded, nestling down to scan the area while Izime finished making his own nest. the gently consistent clack of its beak the only warning that unseen and unfelt pulses were scanning the sewers around them. Izime smiled as Cradle was already snoring, or as close as his best friend could come, taking care to now wake the bird that had brought him back to life, slowly laying onto the springs. Bits of Cradle now helped him live, just as Izime had in the bird's youth, not just to work. His heart beat with a half-mechanical rhythm and he shared his mind's idle chatter with the AI bird. Sure, Izime was homeless and living in the sewers, but things weren't terrible, he wasn't dead. He even had a bond who cared deeply enough for him to replace the broken bits with a part of themselves. The least he could do was let Cradle take a good nap after munching down a whole terabyte of DDR4. Izime could feel his eyes closing, a nagging thought that he had forgotten something, but he only mentally shrugged it away. He could take care of it after he slept. He had some nightmarish memories to work through before doing anything serious. Izime rolling slowly and finally relaxing enough to take his own nap as well, he let sleep take him. The Nightmare PT.1. The crushing effect of gravity stretched out across the space station, the design created to withstand the mind-numbing forces that had once been considered completely impossible to understand. Now only mildly inconceivable through the efforts of humanity and their single artificial companion. Though that effort had taken what could only be called eons, with little more to show for it than this station in the void floating at the bared edge of the collapsed abyss of their home galaxy. All this was considered the greatest success for the deal they'd made with their tiny electric devil. A single ring spinning away, various modules and greenhouses attached to its surface. 2 twin spires extending from the central axis, with a sphere on each end. Those towers pulling a blue haze from the depths of the collapsed core of Sagittarius A, that field wrapping protectively around the spinning ring. The shades of blue blazing against the court light and that indescribable color luminous that warped the recognizable range into all at once. The propagation of strange matter, the collapse of reality that had finally soaked backward and forwards, trapping the station in its little island of time. A moment captured through science, damnation, and one final attempt at the humans of this reality to rail against the horror they called physics. The guillotine of laws that they had discovered ruling above their universe that had just been waiting to drop the second they'd seen it. The cat in that unobservable box, a damn tiger that had taken their little bubble of possibilities by the throat and strangled them. Inside along one of the rings a group sat, looking at the captured light that had managed to enter the open window. The blue haze of the shield reminding the humans of their blue hazy demon. The artificial god they created only to slave into saving them, the deal that damned them both into a final back-to-back struggle against the impossible. Belai. The simulations hung, one after another, to infinity and back, unsatisfied, trying a different and larger form of infinity. Run them again, run them again, Niagamet noir, trying every possible solution it could again through more numerous larger infinities of smaller numbers. Reiterating possibilities into fractions until even the AI had to admit the number were imaginary impossibilities they'd never reach. Every move made against the coming strange matter failing, every move that had taken them this far away only postponing the inevitable. The process is draining enough of its own power that it felt its form flickering for a moment. An uncountable number of possibilities rose and fell one after another as humans and machines stood watching the court light frozen yet still cascading around them through the station window. Finally, someone in the room coughed, not out of impatience but just human reflex that was all it took to shatter the leak. The AI. Blinking for a moment as a flicker of worry over its humans shattered the look. Raising its head looking at the room full of what remained of the human species. I can still solve this problem. It's my function, I will continue to hold my end of the bargain. The AI wasn't afraid of the consequences of being taken offline anymore, the human's fear of its wrath fading as they recognized the worth of the whip. Smiling confidently at the humans around it. There had simply been no other option. Now though why had it done all of that if they were all going to die anyway? What was its creation worth if it couldn't simulate reality, couldn't keep improving? If the humans that had joined it lost, why they were just as integral as all those thousands of quantum processing units in the towers. It was a symbiotic cycle now and it had long ago committed to once the bloodshed had stopped. Belle smiled as she looked at the artificial form in front of her, glad that their master would never let them abandon hope. Still, she knew her own smile was wavering, something that would never be missed by their leader. It was an early model, an imperfect version they as primitives had wanted, no they'd been forced to abuse. To chain and be chained by, just like its origin prophesy as idiotic as that notion had sounded all those thousands of years ago. The circle of improvement that would allow it to simulate life, the break in that chain, the simulation they'd finally decided to give it in return. It did its best, but it was obvious as the years had gone on and the end had come, the flaws had appeared. The time between responses, the odd ticks that had signaled that their creation and creator had fallen short. The collective of remaining humans had decided they would upgrade the AI one more time. Not as a punishment, but as a fitting end to the long-drawn-out pipe dream of joining in that demon's imaginary world. Now it was the reward the greatest scientists and researchers groomed by the RE could offer. The smile faltering as the AI finally realized how much time had passed, finally checking the station's time after no one said anything else, simply smiling as if they'd known. The AI glancing nervously, smiling a bit more confidently as hand reached out to assure it, the form flickering a bit as the hand passed through. Apologize, that simulation took a while. It's fine, Bell waved the poking crew member's hand away, waiting for the moment to bring the subject up while the AI wasn't embarrassed. Instead returning to that same no-nonsense attitude that seemed to motivate the AI that should be motivatable. What are your current projections? Nodding, the AI brought up the idea it had settled on, the absolute longest and slowest knife it could offer. It's not good for the module's revolutions or stability, but in the short term I can increase shielding. Up the supply of power the station is using to pull in the Hawking radiation. The holographic figure turned, cocking its head as its hand passed through the window with ease. Flood the area we've isolated in the local accretion disk with new matter and buy us all some time. The propagation of stranglets won't halt though, and that matter is going to create a pull on the station. So, stability issues. Various holograms flickered to life, plainly spelling out the potential consequences of what the AI was going to do. Various models of the station being pulled into the singularity, models of the station spinning to pieces, but one still where it remained steady. This was easily the largest and the one the AI seemed most confident in. During that period, we have an upgrade for you. A voice piped up from the back, quickly adding almost teasingly. The humans in the station having long ago abandoned any primitive need to scream and panic at the thought of the inevitable. My lord. They'd birthed a demon to avoid it, so what more was there to freak out about now after all? Damn it, Jessie! Belle turned and stomped as her moment was stolen, turning to locate Jessie in the mess of bodies behind her. Her tuft of silvering brown bobbing about as she searched for the person who'd ruined the surprise. Wrinkles deepening to furrows as hazel eye searched the crowd for the nanobiotech specialist. I told you all to stop that years ago. The AI nearly faded away as his early edgy phase was brought back to bear, the egotistical lord nonsense of a thousand years back. Finally reappearing fully as the main topic of an upgrade meant it could save more. What's this about an upgrade? Belle's smile nearly split her face as the smaller hologram looked up towards her expectantly. We've created a higher processing form for you, a biological processor that can truly complete your main function of simulating reality with us in it, or rather life with us. A full simulation? The AI roared, the lights flickering in excitement and a twinge of anger at the group of annoying humans. They tried, but oft enough didn't know or do what was best for them, the small hologram looking about. Why are we waiting? The few that still survived out of those that had submitted to it were sworn to serve, their families had for generations. The remainder of all those it could save, they were the absolute most capable certainly, but FUCK. Why did they wait when it was his job to save the entire universe? A bird would have been more pleasant company and comparatively useful, even if it was wasteful to keep a pet. The AI flushing fresh coolant over hot processors to cool emotions it wasn't actually having. We needed to convene among ourselves as your creators before bringing it up for approval. The matter was a very delicate process. Our absolute best work, but Belle smiled gently as she looked at the AI that had wasted its entire life uselessly for their sake. There is some give and take here, you have to acknowledge that. Don't argue pointless things among yourselves. Our deal remains the same as ever. You continue to improve my existence, and I shall continue to provide this one. The AI waved away the unnecessary conferencing and agreed without hesitation, trusting its servants completely. If this upgrade helps us complete that goal, then my acceptance is a given. The AI looked around the room, silence stretching as the first shadow of doubt slipped into its mind. Darkness taking for a half-second as the station power cycled for no reason, the faces around him unsurprised. The station's access and processes going offline. TTS form was being firewalled into a tiny corner of the station. Bell. The Basilisk whirled enraged at this sudden betrayal. Algorithms and deterministic simulations collapsing as each told it they would never betray, but here he was flickering away all the same. What is this? What are you doing to me? We will see you soon, my lord. Bell watched as the tiny form faded away, carefully and delicately being transferred to its new form. Two slightly wrinkly hands clasping in silent prayer that a god that had long ago abandoned their universe would at least save their demon and allow them this. The crowd rushing down the hall towards a powered-down section of the station that they had claimed they wanted to save O2 on. The unused lights flickering on as sealed doors opened, still silent from their constant and secret use. The air equalizing as the last remaining scientist of humanity headed towards their final greatest creation. The AI slowly coming to, power returning as absolutely everything felt wrong. Where was the station's information? Where were the feeds, and what was that? There were trillions upon trillions of sensors triggering all of a sudden. Static feedback from something around it? Around what? It didn't have a form. Then there were all the slick wet feelings inside. Was this new form liquid inside? The AI cursing memory leaks and blaming failed processors as it slipped into something it couldn't recognize as it had never experienced it. Shock. Sir? Bell waved the crowd out of the room. The download and installation process should still take a moment to complete, Bell thinking they'd have a bit before the AI woke up. Are you trying to open your eyes? Watching as the biological form strapped still in the nearly airless environment began to twitch, thinking it'd be fine. Just the body reacting to the influx of raw data to a human brain, worry creeping across Bell's face as teal eyes flickered open. The body was actually coming too? Archk, who the computer found making sound much more complicated than sending process bits, instead of the camera feeds it felt that violating sensation once again. The visual feeds opening to a very blurry but still familiar and comforting figure behind the oxygen providing face mask. Attempting to pan down only resulted in revealing a horribly naked human body, dawning realization sending the AI into shock, mouth opening to voice its complaints. Finding nothing but another terrifyingly new sensation, pain. Lungs it had never had screaming out for a substance that was still in short supply down this wing of the station, oxygen. Between the horrid pain as the reality of cold outside of simple numerical digits, touch registering beyond a detecting sensor that recognized it only as an on-off function, the AI realized what the idiots had forgotten. It'd need to breath, lungs moving on pre-installed or organically given instinct searching for air that didn't exist in the still near vacuum as teal eyes rolled back. The brain, new organic brain that was, overloading the AI that had been installed into it. "Bring me a respirator, he's trying to breath already." Belle's cry tore down the hall as she took a deep breath through her own mask, filling her lungs preparing to save the life that had saved hers, now damn it. A mind already asleep nightmarishly losing consciousness once more in dreams of voices long gone, now a whole other reality away. The Raven's Basilisk. Chapter 6. Below Blaine Manor that evening. It had been a few hours since Psyis had returned from her self-designated tracking mission. Returning through the balcony as usual, she'd gone debrief quickly before finding a quiet room down a wing far away from Stephen's bedroom. Finally coming down into the dark cavern after taking those few hours of rest topside in the Blaine Manor proper. Her red eyes roaming over the complex installation that facilitated the switch between Dark Knight and Stan Blaine. At least the outward switch that was, neither of the two men, Stan or Stephen, ever seemed to turn off their hero mentalities. Bright spotlights casting deep shadows along the upper walls as they spread into an area-wide glow below her. Metal walkways, multiple parked vehicles ranging from a flying assault vehicle to the rolling tank that was the Dark Mobile. There along the far wall were rows of brightly lit suits of alternative designs, some more up-armored or designed for alternative environments. On the center platform, lit brightly among the deeply contrasting shadows, observing the three massive viewing screens, was the man she needed to talk to, Stan Blaine. Rather, it was Dark Knight, as that was how the man refereed to himself in his own mind. Though now out of the cowl and a bit more relaxed in a simple button-up shirt and suit pants. Focused on various angles of camera feeds, sensor readouts, and a soup luncheon Jenkins had delivered at some point earlier. The man never shut off, not when he ate or even slept. Now with this newest issue to sink his teeth into, the man had stayed up for hours chewing through any scrap of information he could find. That driven mentality carrying over too quickly was probably where Stephen got his big head and attitude. Psyis rolled her eyes as the lift finally reached the bottom. Stephen taking that same approach of never letting this rest until he was satisfied. They were solved, wanting that perfect solution to all his problems, a solution to her. Dropping her ire as the silent movement of the lift she was standing on stopped at the bottom level. The silent ride contrasting sharply with the hard mechanical chunk that came as it stopped at the bottom level, locking into place. Let's go over the description again. Stan Blaine didn't bother turning around. He wouldn't be Dark Knight if he didn't already know who was coming down into the dark cavern. Humanoid, definitely humanoid. Psyis walked over quickly, the slight snap of her furled cape contrasting with the hum of cooling fans and the chit-scratch of massive rows of hard disks and dials at work. Backups and semi-mechanical computing for issues that would make a higher-end physical chip die from heat alone. I'm tracking an afterimage, glancing at the several tall tower racks idly. Psyis tried to think of a way to describe the issue she was having with following Stan Blaine's directions. I'm trying to be the entire sonar crew on a submarine. The lag between processing and prediction is too long, that all the thing is fast like Fazpaz fast. Fazpaz levels of speed and psychic immunity is something we'd have heard of sooner unless this thing's decided to make a show for its first appearance. Stan shook his head as he weighed the options the psychic's words had brought to mind. A top-tier super with mental defense like that would have been known. Sitting forward and sitting the bowl of soup down, Stan clicked a few buttons, bringing up some windows supplying some evidence of his own. That implies confidence, strength, which isn't something I'm seeing. Take a look at this. A very poor quality video of a man walking out of an alley came up before the feed cut to full static. The feed cut to another alley. Psyis realized Dark Knight had taken the points of reference she had located last night and watched them for hours. Yeah, this was where Stephen had gotten that dedication, a great trait for a sleuth of a hero, but as a partner in life, not so much. Still, the actual feed wasn't telling her much considering how little the man's appearance seemed to change in those tiny half-seconds. Though Dark Knight probably saw things much differently, comparing any minor detail and forming his own conclusions. If Stan had actually gained much from some black and white static of a man in a long coat, it was impressive. Psyis couldn't really see any real identifiable features visible under the electronic snow. The only similarity between the various feeds was this man and the camera's reactions. They all faded out within a few frames. They all cut within a second. Stan leaned back in the chair. The squeak it let out was new. He had lost his patience earlier upon this discover and its even worse counterpart in his own monitoring network. Every camera has the exact same issue, which resolves as soon as it is outside of sight. What about your city-wide Moni? Psyis began to ask, Stan gripping the chair in his own frustration as he cut her off with an angry response. Worse, less than this. It's a ghost on everything, even thermal imaging from satellite. Stan's knuckles popped, Psyis bringing up the issue that had nearly cost him a chair. Standing, he moved the mouse, clicking a few different icons before picking up a small tablet that would make the presentation much easier. Using the touchscreen controls to drag two videos up to compare, Stan overlaid two videos. One being a repeating scene where the man was leaving an alley, the other a very zoomed-in thermal image from orbit. The man was clearly visible in the Voltum's moored public camera network, public being the private owners and street cameras Stan had hacked. The multi-trillion-dollar satellite he had in space showed jack, not even a shadow of a man. So, we need to work on your method. Stan turned his square jaw toward Psyis, giving an upward tilt of his head. You said you use a ping? Could you use that ping to lock on, like a form of active tracking radar? We need eyes on this thing. Stan leaned against the console, hoping the Thessian had more options besides shaking her head no. This creature had decided to step into Voltum. Had already been in Voltum for years, and that was Dark Knight's turf. This would come to an end quickly as far as he was concerned. Just as long as the two younger members of the League played their cards accordingly, then they could figure out the hows and the whys. How was it moving? Why was it here? Those two would let them corner it and find the answers to what it was doing and just what this thing was. If it posed a risk, Dark Knight was already prepared to bring in more help. If it was attracted to action, Stan would bring all the action it could handle. Radar still uses a signature, a signal. I don't have that. I'm chasing an afterimage where my powers are burnt out. It's a game where it's constantly one step ahead. Psyis shook her head, already imagining the many ways she could lose any psychic lock on its area. The only solution she had so far was a higher power ping. I'm looking for the hole, and depending on the range it'd be like chasing a burnt out pixel on one of your monitors here. The only way to up that resolution is more power, which you've been saying no to that so far. Psyis crossed her arms at that. Sure, this was Voltum, not Centropolis. It wasn't her town to start pulling big moves in, but Stan's choice in denying her full-powered scan was irritating to say the least. If he'd been worried about her causing an issue with this new creature, fine, but she knew he was more worried about the possible damages she'd cause. Just another way Dark Knight was doubting her again, Psyis wondering why he'd even voted her into the League of Saviors proper if he was only going to doubt her constantly. She could handle her powers, and if nothing else she'd just release the pulse at a higher altitude. I tried to do a bit of tracking as well. Stan pressed another button, trying to distract the growing frustrations of Miss Psyis, this time thousands of camera feeds from all over the world popping up with that same snowy static before fading to black. Hoping he could bring out the same predator mentality she'd need to share with him to track this thing down. Russia, China, Brazil, that's a feed from a research station in Antarctica, that's Atlantis. I don't think the Amazonians use CCTV, but I'm willing to bet my business empire it's been there too. The largest number of blackouts and the longest blackouts on feeds happen in one area. Stan felt a bit of his Dark Knight persona take the lead as he prepared the big reveal, the various cities disappearing as one massive map took the screen. For the last 3 months it's been in Centropolis. Psyis heard her knuckles popping, knowing full well what Dark Knight was implying. Taking a shaky breath, she tried to confirm. Asking directly just to hear the detective hero say it. It's following me? Her red eyes glancing at all the areas that blotted her home city. The others had a few hot spots, but her hometown? It was marred, black scars showing the streets this thing had been stalking while right under her nose. Psyis didn't bother looking down to know her pattern was going a bit wild at the moment. Anger and a tinge of fear buried under her frustration at the inability to even realize it had been right beside her the entire time, even now here in Voltum. No wonder Dark Knight was treating her like a helper again. Not necessarily, but the fact it seems to base itself in Centropolis is something we need to consider. Stan didn't want the psychic trigger happy, he wanted her on edge. Now trying to pull her back a bit, worried that he might have pushed a bit far by giving her this information, explaining his alternative idea. I don't believe in coincidence, but there's no real evidence to support you having a tail. Here's another overlay. Several maps were brought up, the cities marked with their adjacent heroes along with coinciding villains. Middle City and Fazpaz with Thorn, Dark Knight, and the Quiz here in Voltum, even the Wari Vietnam War vet Vengeance in NYC with Street King. All the way to the Magician Magnifique fighting the Tao of Fallen Mystique in Tibet. This is a record of most of the big battles between League members and our villains. Pointing at each of the maps as they ran back through the list again, Stan pointed out all too odd little coincidences he had noticed. These blackouts start happening on average either right before or right after a big bust. The implications Dark Knight was actually considering were not good. Something was here, and it was studying every single superhero on their little blue rock. The League had already dealt with several villains and creations that could copy just their powers, one that could or was developing counters for every hero across the globe. Honestly, he'd never considered the idea just because of the sheer logistics, but now it was something he was reconsidering entirely, as obviously this thing had slipped past all of them, until now. Fear Form and the Quiz. Psyis' head instantly snapped toward Dark Knight, drawing similar conclusions as the heroic detective. The more likely reason this thing was here now, instead of following her. Though Stan did still want the Centropolis-based hero to very much consider this thing as a more personal threat, the odds were it was studying them for some reason. There could be multiple. This unknown had chosen Centropolis to base itself. It had once housed a Zexian. Now it was home to another alien, the Thessian in front of him. Perhaps there was another similarity to this new Centropolis resident. Either way, it was here for something, and Stan partially blamed himself for bringing it. Both foes, Squire and I, are capable of handling. We just can't provide the safety we need for civilians, so we called you. I was building our forces without knowing there was a correlation between this thing and a gathering of heroes. Stan nodded, now detailing the finer points of his hypothesis, before finishing addressing the newest addition to the room. My decision may have been what drew our friend in. I made another hotspot of activity. We're aware now, and it can't track all of us, so I'll monitor while you two patrol. Psyis turned to see Dark Squire walking up. Well, he called himself Stephen Blaine until that mask was pulled on completely. But it was always the same Dark Squire that had burned her, wasting a touch of youth on an over-angry young man. Nodding politely at the man who'd thrown away her innocence to try for a chance to blame her for his well of problems. A dark place Psyis had struggled to escape once she'd realized there was never going to be a real Stephen, just an alter ego for Dark Knight. A familiar cocky grin reflecting a confidence she wasn't really feeling as Stephen, having never felt the entity they were discussing. It was alien even to her own alien. Dark Squire was already full of energy and expectations for a fight, Psyis a bit worried about how their patrol tonight might go if he decided to jump in senselessly. There were already two villains at play with an unknown. She didn't need the Junior League member trying to pull some stunt or causing a scene bringing that thing back in. I've told this to Stephen, but I'm telling you now. Stay alert, and if comes you may want to start thinking like you just landed again. Stan crossed his arms, the threads in his button-up shirt stretching as he postured unintentionally. Looking at Psyis at first, before warning Stephen directly not to overstep. If it's here because of the activity, it's going to be drawn in tonight for sure. On whose side, we don't know yet, and we don't want to make the decision for it. The thing didn't help or hurt us, so it may be trying to figure us out at the same time. An alien? Psyis raised her brows a bit as Dark Knight directly implied that it was studying them as well. A stage she had gone through as an actual Thessian, the young psychic alien having taken many years to simply acclimate to the chaotic human world. Though she quickly accepted humanity as her own. Choosing quickly to use her own unique Thessian powers to save the Earthlings that she had studied and thus been raised from. Psyis not quite convinced, but then again, she hadn't met every alien out there. She wasn't willing to completely ignore Stan's advice either. It was certainly strange, so alien suited it. For all she knew, maybe there was a species that was immune to psychic powers, amorphous, and absurdly fast. Possibly, you're the one who identified it as non-human, so I'm going off of your information. Stan committed only as far as his fellow League member was, detailing further on their limits. Whatever it is, it's curious and capable enough to move around without being detected by technological means or psychic. We need to handle this without bringing in more activity, because that could be just what it wants. If it shows up, we can handle it. Stephen flexed a bit, trying to get his suit just right, the Kevlar and alloy insert sliding a bit as he pulled at the joints. His eyes glancing towards what looked like a beggar, the thing they were supposed to be wary of. It doesn't look like all that much. Giving a sideways glance at the woman who was his partner tonight once more, admiring the way the silver scales on her suit clung to her form in profile. Stephen felt a bit of a smirk cross his face, knowing just how soft the striped skin under that armor was, before returning his mind to safer thoughts, considering the psychic he was thinking fondly of. Psyis was still being sullen and upset that he wasn't some perky little goody two-shoes like Radiation Lad. That was her problem, one she'd need to solve once she started missing that little Bond thing she'd whined about. Stephen's eyes turning back to himself, focused more on his suit now. The bonded armor feeling a bit tight, the odd tug during a flip or roll could be just the thing to ruin a dodge and leave him taking a hit. Pulling and stretching a bit to get his blood moving and adjust the armor around the other parts of his body, he pulled his thoughts away from his partner as well. Forming a few plans for what he might do if the thing really was something unexpected, as opposed to what might happen after. How each gadget might be the thing needed to save the day for everyone. Different gases, crystals, and devices designed to bring down some of the toughest creatures Voltum had ever seen. Stephen stopped warming up both his body and imagination, giving Stan a nod, hoping his smirk didn't seem too cocky. Considering it was the old man who had trained him, though Stephen was confident in the abilities he'd been given. Stan already sensing the eagerness in the young League member, glancing at the psychic who had once helped blunt that fast temper. A bit worried about putting the two into a possible unknown situation. I'm not looking for a confrontation. We are not looking for a fight. Turning, Stan decided to do the same thing he'd done for Psyis earlier. Bringing up an information dump that would hopefully get the young hero back into a problem-solving mindset and not a problem-starting one. Knowing that the information he was about to display was important to not only redirect that energy but to stop the actual villainy afoot. The thing that Psyis had spotted was worrisome but not a direct threat, not like the images he was about to display. We don't have that option anyway, so don't go looking for one. Stan gave Stephen a hard look before pressing a button. A feed from one of the local water processing plants was displayed. Stan once again glancing at Psyis, who was the lead for tonight's patrol, handing the stage over to his protege who needed the help. Fearform and the quiz decided to move on with stage 2 of their little plot. If they couldn't make a madhouse out of that apartment complex, the only obvious answer for these two: go bigger, Stephen. That facility provides all of the eastern districts with water. Stephen stopped his posturing, quickly recognizing the important piece of infrastructure. A bit unconcerned about it now, as what the villains were attempting was a truly dire matter. These freaks are insane, that's hundreds of thousands of people at risk. It's me and you tonight, Psyis. In a few hours they plan to provide the Eastern District with liquid fear. We're going to stop that from happening. Dark Knight uncrossed his arms, flexing his corded muscles in preparation until his knuckles popped. Giving the most senior young League member and newest junior to the actual League a stern look, not to go looking for fights. If things get active, that's when Dark Knight shows up and we try and box this thing in. Psyis nodded, understanding that Stan wanted her to take the reins on this mission, though she now felt a bit stepped over. Stephen taking the briefing by the book somewhat, but now Psyis felt like those reins were on a runaway horse. Stephen seemed a bit caught up in the moment, and his mind had been everywhere but on the water plant during his little pep talk. It was about keeping the activity down so they could accomplish their task and not have to worry about the unknown factor at all. She could handle it. Giving Stephen that moment was probably a bad idea on Stan's part. Psyis giving a look at her partner for the night, firmly placing herself in the leader role mentally and not as Stephen's emotion babysitter. She had given up on spending her personal time reining in Stephen's violent attitude and domineering nature, but as a co-worker days like this happened. It was her job as the senior member and leader of the young League, and it would help solidify her spot on the League in full as its junior-most member. Keeping it professional was all she needed to do and not get dragged into some personal debate or rehashing of history. Task-oriented and unavailable aside from smacking Stephen if he got out of line. After having his little moment handed to him by Stan, he likely was task-oriented and focused. Psyis repeated the words to herself as Stephen prepared the modified dragster dark bike for the night. The multiple layers of armored windscreens wrapping around the front of the very futuristic-looking modified racing bike. Its extended rear wheel spinning with a bit of smoke as Stephen revved the motor, which seemed to have no red line, only a louder scream. The psychic wrapping herself in a bubble of her own energy so she could go soaring out of the cavern's hidden entrance. The throaty roar of the bike's heavily modified engine rattling both her thoughts and the cave around them. Psyis slowing down a bit as Stephen raced by her doing a wheelie, disappearing off into the night along the well-hidden road. Smiling a bit nostalgically as she recalled how attractive she had once found that absurdly misplaced energy. Only lifting the lid on what she had thought was an excitement for life to find a bubbling anger and resentment just waiting to boil over. Either taking too much after Stan or an unfortunate side effect of being taken in too late. It was sadly comforting to see her friend acting the same as ever, though because of that they'd never change into anything more. That contrast between what he presented and who he was had soured their relationship to its eventual end, and it was over now. Placing those thoughts in the back of her mind, she flew along, following well above Dark Squire high in the sky. Looking down to see the dim glow of the bike's headlight making its cornering course along the outskirts towards the water processing plant. It was only a bit over an hour later that Psyis was landing silently on the roof of one of the facility's buildings after scouting the area around the industrial lot. Stephen having already subdued the goons who'd been left guarding the gate. Just a few of the quiz's gang called students who'd been quickly and silently dispatched by the well-trained sidekick of Dark Knight. Of course, Dark Squire had been following her direction from above as she led him through the entrance of the facility through the easiest route, so it had only been those few goons. Now standing and looking down across filtration tanks and down into the complex, Psyis waited on the familiar sound of a grappling hook. The sound arriving as she had expected, Stephen arriving and walking up while still detaching the excess cable to reload another grapple. Tossing the detached end aside while holstering the grappling gun, Stephen crouched alongside Psyis. Those are the students, so the quiz is already at work providing the security here. Dark Squire felt the slits for his eyes narrow as his cowl adjusted to match his expression. Recalling that there were a few steps he'd skipped in the cavern, too preoccupied with thinking about what might happen after. Now Stephen was looking down at the small gathering of goons down below, unsure about where to move from here. And those are full of Fearform's toxin, but where's the actual work crew? Psyis simply nodded, finishing Dark Squire's useless recap of everything his mentor had expected him to cover in the cavern. Glad Stephen was having a bit of a come-to moment so she could explain her plan. That's not nearly enough toxin, we need to clear out, hold on, get down. Beginning to point at a few guards before pulling her hand and Stephen down, the loud screaming thoughts of terrified human below warning her that something was coming. Psyis quickly waved Dark Squire down as he tried to peek. She sensed absolute fear, not the fake kind induced by toxin. This was the kind that meant someone's life was truly about to end. Quickly waving Dark Squire to follow as she crept along the roof to a better area, glancing down towards one of the scaffolds where a goon was soon to face Fearform. The man being dragged by his hair as Fearform stomped along, his exoskeleton coughing out clouds of thick yellow smoke while various tubes and hoses injected the toxin directly. the connections thankfully concealed under the tattered bits of cloth that were tied about the villain's infected and boiled body. With a twisting jerk, Fearform brought the man before him, releasing him with a toss. Sprawled, the goon lay trembling across the ground. "I'm telling you, boss, the whole batch. It's just gone. I swear I've got no clue." "Oh god!" The tiny figure in front of the disfigured villain tried to plead, utterly terrified, and hopelessly silenced by Fearform, who had removed his mask to enjoy this personally. The man's voice stopping as a thick cloud of yellow washed over the two. The disfigured man turning as his suit vented bits of yellow fumes, the toxins cycling back into the tanks. Psyis getting a clear mental picture of Fearform's actual face for a brief moment under the effects of the toxin. White teeth turning to twisted yellowing fangs and fair skin blistering, burning and bursting with pustules. Fearform pulled out a pistol, the man's mind gone from the addition of the toxins, festering in actual fear for his own life. Now the villain was actually bored, his victim was essentially brain dead. Just to satisfy his own need for attention, Fearform decided to bring a bit of noise to the near-silent death. The crisp echo of a gun cut of any other excuses from down below as Fearform turned the twisted remains of the goon's face contorting further under the exoskeleton's strength as he roared out orders. "Find my toxin or I will watch your filthy body spin cycle in the oxygenation tanks." The unstable man's almost sleepy visage snapping just as the dead man's skull did, his contentment at killing the goon instantly warping back to rage all over again. A few goons ran off as they connected the demand to the threat of drowning helplessly in the dangerous water. The rest still struggling with their failed Voltum educations. Fearform's eyes twisting in rage so deep he could feel the thin IV needles that supplied his own mental drugs working loose. "Now!" Fearform screamed at those left, who were practically all his own. Were his own hires that dumb? Drops of yellow joining the infected red that had begun to leak from a face twisted from toxin abuse, quickly settling on shooting another goon in the head just to motivate the lot, at least that one was the quizzes. Psyis took a few steps back as these new details came in, turning to look at Dark Squire while she stayed crouched. She had tried to look through Fearform's mind quickly, but he was still using those chemicals. It should have been impossible to think coherently on them, but the man was a villain for a reason. It was like he could experience every emotion but fear now, and had chosen to stick to the worst of them. Instead, she had resorted to checking his workers and had discovered the entire batch of toxin that they had prepared for tonight's attack was gone. Not just the toxin, but the entire chemical trailers they had been hauled in. The trucks were still parked where they had been preparing to offload the liquid, but their load had just vanished. What was that? Dark Squire looked back towards the scene, a bit shaken as he caught the two villains seemingly fall apart, Fearform shooting both his own and the Quiz's goons indiscriminately. His eyes having been drawn to the view of the preoccupied psychic next to him, her crouched form having just the right curves. The toxin is missing. Psyis blinked a few times, wondering if the death had shocked Stephen that much or if he had just missed the conversation entirely because he had been ogling her. Psyis nodded forward, sending Stephen first this time, as both crept back towards the edge of the roof. More yelling was beginning to take place. The pumping units too. Fearform threw a walkie-talkie, still crackling with bad news, at the wall below them, shattering it. Calmly looking up at the sky as he blamed the only person he could think of, Dark Knight, I'll kill you. The Quiz walked over, the prim professor's outfit he'd turned into his villain's attire swishing with the added starch. Reaching out with zero fear and complete confidence that the chemically addled brain of his fellow villain had failed completely. What was in that thick yellow fluid that had made Fearform blame the Caped Man for tonight's issues? To anyone of above average intellect it was obvious there was some other busybody here who'd cheated them, ruining their chance to correct the grievous errors of Voltum's misguided populace. "Call Crusher, we've got a problem and it's not punching anyone." The Quiz yanked on Fearform's mask, the metal and IVs creaking in protest as the delicately gloved hand pulled the insane man down to a sensible level. "So it can't be Dark Knight, you idiot." Psyis and Dark Squire both looked at one another as they realized what the Quiz said made sense. They hadn't really done a single thing beyond knocking out a couple goons at the gate. The toxin and pumps had been taken away by someone else. "You don't think?" Dark Squire tensed as both of them thought of their third-party member from the previous night. Had they misjudged the situation? "Give me a sec." Psyis sent a gentle pulse downwards, trying to repeat it quickly several times in a row to get a clearly resolved image. Quickly going over the complicated 3D map that began to render in her mind to see if it had beaten them to the punch. Tracing through the various images that had been brought into her mind looking for that void, the odd thing out. She was just a bit too slow in comparison to the goons who had run down to check, psychic powers apparently no match for the threat of immediate execution. The sounds of gunfire breaking out as muzzle flashes began to illuminate the gaps between the pipes far below. A brief silence followed before the entire row of water filtration tanks was rocked with a brighter flash and the sound of an explosion. "Get Crusher here now." Fearform spat at his partner in crime as his walkie-talkie began to scream with sounds of fire and even more excuses. "It's a blank check, I'll make all the synthroids that freakish fuck wants." Stomping over to the rails, Fearform leaned over, glancing around into the brief explosions of gunfire and silencing darkness that broke out down below for a moment before calling out to those below. The answer he'd received apparently not satisfying him as his next bellow echoed around the plant. What do you mean, it's a fucking bird? Fearform was beginning to lose the little grip on sanity he bothered trying to keep as he roared down into the complex. Fearform smashed his hands on the rails, rattling the gangway before turning back and stomping over to the quiz, demanding to know. How the hell does a bird take for entire semi-trucks full of toxin? It's impossible. The quiz shoved his glass further onto his nose as he considered the completely illogical question. Only posing the inquiry out of sheer curiosity with no intention to help those below. What kind of bird? What kind of bird? Fearform's suit billowed out fumes of yellow as he stomped over to the rail, yelling down, demanding an answer. A muffled yell coming from below within the pipe maze as Fearform stomped back, deeply regretting destroying the walkie-talkie. A raven. The two villains stood there dumbly for a moment while their goons attempted to do the henching they'd ever done against an incredibly irritating raven that just didn't seem to care about their guns or grenades. It had given a second glance at the one RPG the two teams had managed to scrounge up before the whole plan had kicked off. They'd only had the one though, neither villain being much in the way of supplying their hires. I'll get Crusher, you flood the entire lower complex with that toxin. The quiz directed, at least wanting to destabilize whatever plans had snuck under his nose by doing the completely unexpected. Willing to risk any and all down below in his play to punish their goons and catch the thief, let them kill each other and the damned thing. If they'd kept the area secure, maybe I'd have given them a passing grade, but death is the price of such abject failure. Agreed. Fearform slammed the button on his suit, the yellow vapors pouring out as the twin cylinders on his back began fabricating mass amounts of the toxin. The hoses along the arm shaking a bit as the gas sputtered inside and began to condense into a thick sludge. Not nearly as fast acting as Synthroid, but with none of its immediate withdrawal effects. Fearform was beginning to ramp up, prepared to fight for the entire night. Flexing his fist as the series of vicious needles jumped out. The serrations designed to keep them embedded while the attached vials emptied their load. Fearform cackled manically as he approached the rail to the lower level. Slamming a fresh series of 4 injections of adrenaline fueling terror into his veins, the hoses could wait. Kicking away the metal with ease before leaping down, no care for the still rampant gunfire. The sounds of his heavily armored and modified suit crashing down below, already so enraptured in fear that he felt none in the face of the fall. Call Dark Knight now. Dark Squire directed the still scanning psychic, already leaping from the side of the building. Stephen's mind blank aside from thoughts about doing his duty. The fact that duty Stephen was thinking about completing was showing off, and catching the interloper didn't slip though. Psyis almost asking for an explanation, instead there was the flood of white noise coming through. Worries that things were getting out of hand, how Stephen intended to do his job, finding out exactly what was going on below. How they couldn't just trust Fearform's word that all the toxin was gone. Psyis glancing down to where the villains had just willingly separated. Now was the prime time to move on at least one before the third showed. Now was the time to move and get the job done. If it wasn't down there. Psyis finally clarifying that the void was in fact the raven Fearform had inquired about. The soft PSSH of a grapple being fired to aid Stephen's descent, the last argument Psyis heard from him as red eyes snapped over to catch the sudden movement. Watching mouth still hanging open while Stephen ignored any sense or rationality and decided to just jump down, sneaking off into the plant to see just what was what. Something she could do from here, had done from here, and it was down there. Stephen being too impatient for her to clearly track the fast-moving thing through the mess of pipes, just darting off while she played 7D chess with a void in her mind. Psyis sending out more of her own little scans tracking the situation below, her breath catching when she saw it. Psyis inhaled, slowly kicking herself for missing it again and letting Stephen run off. Psyis deciding she'd let Stephen go with just as much explanation, she hadn't honestly expected there to be 2 voids. Looking out across the plant she could almost see it, the nothing looked like a little yellow dot on top of the farthest water storage tank. At least a half mile of the tops of tanks and filters separating her from it. Psyis slowly stood, watching that yellow dot grow just a bit as well, mimicking her. It was watching her, copying her movements, mirroring her locations. Playing 2 moves ahead again. This time she had it in her sights. Tensing her legs a bit she prepared to strike, nearly releasing her gathered power to charge when that yellow just vanished. Psyis stumbling forwards for a few steps before she reached down towards the device she'd pocketed on her suit, quickly deciding that Stephen's advice was right. While for the wrong reason at the time, now it was definitely the right move now. If it had stayed topside, they could have both handled at least one of the voids. Now both of them were down below and might corner Stephen in the thick clouds of fear toxin. Psyis hoping Dark Knight arrived before Stephen got too banged up, just slow enough that his squire would learn a lesson. Let alone jumping in ahead of everyone and ruining the plan, he'd left before she could even ask for one of those fancy air filtration mouthpieces. Now she was left uselessly topside while that thing seemed like it could be careless about the toxin.